In the year 793, when the northern winds carried whispers of iron sails upon the rivers, the vast forests and waterways of the Slavic lands lay wrapped in a mist both protective and haunting. The rivers were veins of life, twisting and flowing through marsh and woodland, feeding villages with fish and water, but also carrying strangers from beyond. Those who lived here knew that rivers were never only gentle companions. They could betray, they could mislead, and they could be used as snares just as easily as they offered drink. On the banks of the Dnieper, huts of timber and clay clung low to the earth, their roofs pressed with reeds and thatch. Smoke rose slowly from hearths where women stirred stews of millet, lentils, and onions, while the smell of dried fish lingered in the rafters. Chickens scattered in the dirt, their wings flapping against the legs of children who laughed while carving small wooden boats to push into the current. Life seemed ordinary as it had for generations. Yet every villager felt the tension of the river, the way it widened to accept long, sharp ships whose shapes were not born of Slavic hands. Men sharpened spears by the firelight, their bodies lean from hunting and labor. The river was both the heart of trade and the path of invasion, and the stories of northern raiders reached the villages long before their sails appeared. The old ones remembered tales of boats that came silently, cutting through the water like knives. They spoke of steel helmets catching sunbeams, of men who came with hunger for silver and slaves. The Slavs were no strangers to war. Yet their battle was not of open fields and banners. It was in the hush of reeds, in the patient waiting behind thickets, in the places where the river narrowed and bent. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to hold your breath in the reeds while listening to the splash of oars, waiting for the exact moment to strike? It was not courage that burned in the chest, but a strange stillness, as if one's heartbeat must merge with the sound of water itself. There was a place called Drutsk, where the Dnieper's waters wound around sandbars and hidden shallows. To strangers, it appeared as a simple crossing, a way to reach the villages beyond. To those who lived here, it was a trap as finely set as a hunter's snare for deer. Logs had been sunk beneath the surface, sharpened stakes buried where the current disguised them. To sail unknowing into that stretch was to feel the sudden scrape of wood against hull, to find a ship trapped in the grip of mud and hidden timber. And when the ship slowed, when confusion rippled across the oars, the forest would seem to breathe. Men would rise from the rushes with bows drawn, their arrows tipped with fire, their cries echoing across the mist. The river that had carried the invader became his tomb, the water swallowing men heavy with iron. But before such a battle unfolded, there was always waiting. The waiting was long, patient, quiet. Days before the news of sails upriver reached them, the Slavic men would sit in circles, their voices low. Old women would tie charms of bone and flax above the doors, whispering prayers to Rod, to Perun, to the spirits of river and tree. Children were hushed, told not to stray to the banks, told to keep the fires low. The evening before the trap was sprung, one could walk among the huts and feel the weight of silence. The smoke of birchwood fires clung low, the dogs restless, noses lifted toward scents only they could sense. Men smeared ash across their skin, blending into the bark and soil. The river itself seemed to slow, as if it knew what was coming. When the longships finally came, their prows carved like dragons, they slid across the current as if nothing could touch them. The raiders sang low, their voices thick with ale, believing themselves hunters. Yet in the reeds, in the damp air, the true hunters waited. The first log struck with a hollow crack. A ship lurched, tilted, and the voices rose in sudden alarm. Arrows hissed from the banks, lighting oil upon the water. The smell of burning pitch filled the air. Some tried to leap overboard, but the reeds closed around them, sharp stakes rising unseen. The cries echoed, but the forest gave no answer, only the steady rhythm of arrows loosed and the roar of fire taking hold of timber. By morning, the river was calm again. Ash drifted like gray blossoms across the current. Charred hulls sank beneath the water, their shadows swallowed whole. The villagers emerged slowly, their bare feet sinking into wet soil. Women gathered the arrows. Men dragged timbers ashore. There was no rejoicing, no cheer, only quiet necessity. The threat had been met, but it would return, as it always did. Life resumed, but never fully untouched. A mother would glance at her child's carved wooden boat floating in the shallows and think of the larger ships swallowed the night before. A fisherman would cast his net and feel the rough scrape of a charred plank caught beneath the surface. The river never forgot. It carried memory in its depths, just as it carried silt and stone. And so the Slavs lived with both gift and curse, knowing the waters could sustain and betray. Every ambush was not merely survival, but a prayer whispered to the future, that the villages would endure, that the children would grow, that the river would remain theirs. The year 793 passed into 794, and the mist still gathered along the banks at dawn. Somewhere in the north, more sails were being built, more oars carved. The Slavs did not know when they would come again, only that the river would be ready. The year turned with the quiet creak of frozen branches, for winter had settled deep upon the Slavic lands. The river, that restless companion of every village, lay locked beneath a brittle sheet of ice. Snow drifted across the roofs of the huts, covering the thatch in white mounds, so that from a distance the dwelling seemed almost like buried stones rising out of the earth itself. Smoke from hearth fires curled upward into the gray sky, and within, the people huddled close together, warmed by embers, stories, and the constant work of keeping life alive during the long season of hunger. In such winters, time slowed, yet minds did not sleep. Men carved spear shafts by the glow of tallow candles, the sound of knives rasping against wood steady as breath. Women wove flax into cloth, their fingers calloused, their lips murmuring old chants that kept the rhythm alive. Children, restless from confinement, etched patterns into the frost that clung to shutters, their imaginations leaping between the crackle of the fire and the whispers of the elders. The elders always spoke of the rivers. Even when the water was frozen into silence, the tales flowed. They told how the great spirits of water and forest demanded respect, how those who ignored them were punished. They told of strange men who came from far seas, who carried fire upon their ships and blood upon their blades. They told, too, of how the river itself could be taught to rise against them if one knew where to set the traps. During those winter nights, as the frost crept across the beams of the huts, the villagers prepared. Stakes were shaped and hardened by fire. Ropes were braided thick, knots tested until they could not slip. Hunters gathered branches of willow and birch to weave screens that would later hide men crouched in reed beds. Even when the river was asleep, the village sharpened itself for the day it would wake again, for the day when sails might return. Have you ever wondered what it is to prepare for danger, not by facing it openly, but by weaving it slowly into your life? To spend months readying for a storm that may or may not come. In this rhythm, the Slavs lived, neither restless nor reckless, but steady as the growth of trees, patient as the slow thaw of ice. When spring broke, the ice groaned and cracked. Chunks drifted downriver, catching against the banks, grinding together in a music as ancient as stone. The waters swelled, flooding meadows and soaking the soil until the hut seemed to float upon damp earth. Children splashed in puddles, their laughter sharp against the heavy air of thaw. Men returned to the banks, testing their traps, watching for signs in the current. Spring meant planting, too. Women walked the dark soil with baskets of seeds, scattering rye and barley, whispering small prayers with each handful. The fields stretched wide under the pale sun, their furrows carved by oxen, their ridges marking both survival and faith. While the earth swallowed seed, the men's eyes always wandered back to the river, for the water was both a cradle and a mouth, always ready to consume. And then, one evening, as the light thinned and turned copper along the surface of the water, a boy ran breathless into the village. He had been tending to his father's nets downriver when he glimpsed the thing that made his chest tighten and his feet pound the earth, the black line of sails against the horizon. The word spread swiftly. Men laid down their tools. Women gathered children close. The dogs barked and strained at their ropes. The village seemed to inhale all at once, as though every chest had drawn in the same sharp breath. By nightfall, the preparations had begun. Fires were doused, though a faint glow remained in each hut for warmth. Men carried the sharpened stakes down to the water's edge, where they pressed them into the mud, angling their points to face against the current. Others hauled weighted logs into the shallows, submerging them until only a ripple betrayed their presence. In the forest nearby, hunters cut fresh branches and wove them into screens that blended with the reeds. These would shelter the archers, who would lie in wait like shadows, their bows already strung, their arrows already fletched. The old men muttered blessings, tossing grains of salt into the river to appease its spirit, to remind it that they were its children. The night was restless. Few slept, though many lay with their eyes closed, listening to the crackle of the hearths, the drip of thawed water through the thatch, the faint rustle of reeds along the bank. Somewhere out in the darkness, the invaders' ships cut slowly closer. Morning brought a pale mist that clung to the river as though it had been woven from the breath of the forest. The villagers moved silently to their stations. Men crouched low in the reeds, their bodies painted with ash and clay until they seemed half-earth themselves. Archers pressed close behind screens, their eyes sharp. Others waited further back with axes and ropes, ready to strike should any foe reach the shore. The first longship emerged as if birthed from the fog itself, its prow carved in the shape of a snarling beast, its hull creaking against the current. Oars rose and fell in unison, the sound of water slapping steady as a drum beat. The men aboard were large, wrapped in furs and iron, their faces fierce beneath helmets. Behind them, more ships loomed, the line stretching across the river's bend. The Slavs did not move. The mist curled around them, hiding their breath, hiding their fear. The ship slid closer, unsuspecting, drawn into the narrowing bend where the water grew shallow. It began with the grinding sound of timber striking timber. The prow of the lead ship jolted against the submerged log. Shouts broke out as the vessel shuddered, its oars thrown out of rhythm. Another ship struck a stake, the wood piercing its side with a groan. Water rushed in, and the men aboard scrambled to steady themselves. From the reeds, the arrows flew. They hissed through the fog, striking shields and flesh alike. Some were wrapped in pitch and fire, their flames licking across the planks, setting them alight. The invaders roared, raising shields, drawing blades. But the river had already betrayed them. Ships collided, caught in the snare of sharpened wood. Men leapt overboard, only to vanish beneath a surface where hidden stakes waited. The villagers moved like shadows, their feet sure upon the muddy bank. They loosed arrows, pulled ropes, struck with axes when any raider tried to clamber ashore. The water boiled with struggle, with splashing, with cries swallowed by mist. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was quiet. The river carried broken planks, floating shields, and the still bodies of those who had thought themselves hunters. Smoke drifted from charred hulls, curling upward like offerings to unseen gods. The villagers remained hidden a long while after the last cry had faded, waiting for certainty, waiting for silence to return. Only when the sun rose higher did they emerge. Men pulled timbers ashore, cutting them free to reuse or burn. Women, their faces drawn but resolute, gathered what could be salvaged. Children, kept back by stern hands, peered wide-eyed at the strange weapons, the iron helmets glinting dully in the morning light. There was no celebration. There never was. Victory was survival, and survival demanded no boasting. Yet that night, when the fires burned again, when stew was ladled into clay bowls, the elders nodded slowly. The river had kept them safe once more. But in every heart lay the same thought. The raiders would come again. They always did. And each time, the river would have to rise to meet them, for as long as the people lived upon its banks. The mist rolled back across the water, thick and unbroken, as though it too had secrets to keep. The days that followed the ambush slipped by in a strange quiet, as though the river itself wished to rest after the violence it had carried. Ash floated downstream in lazy swirls, vanishing into the wider waters. The villagers returned to their routines, yet an unspoken heaviness lingered. They knew that victory against raiders was not an end, but a pause, a breath between storms. Men walked the banks, eyes tracing the current as though searching for answers in its ripples. The women bent over the fields, their hands sowing rye into dark soil, but their ears pricked at every sound carried by the wind. The children, usually free to chase each other through meadows, were kept close. Even the dogs seemed restless, pacing the village edge with noses lifted to scents that only they could read. At night, when the fires burned low, talk returned to the traps. Some said they had been placed well, that the river itself had conspired with them. Others argued that more must be done, for each raid seemed larger than the last. In the hush of the hearth, elders repeated the oldest stories, of spirits dwelling in reeds, of guardians hidden in the water, of ancestors who had once turned rivers into weapons with a single whispered prayer. One such elder was Dobroslav, his beard white as frost, his eyes clouded yet sharp when they caught the light. He spoke, slowly, as though each word needed time to breathe. "The river gives," he said, his voice carrying through the hut, "and the river takes. We must always feed it as much as it feeds us. If we take fish, we leave grain. If we take water, we give salt. And when it carries our enemies, we must remind it that it is ours." His hand trembled as it lifted a carved staff, etched with spirals and runes. Children gazed at it with wide eyes, believing that in its wood lay the very memory of the water. So they prepared again. Ropes were mended, stakes sharpened anew. Hunters moved deeper into the forest, gathering pitch from pine trees, cutting fresh willow branches for screens. The rhythm of life continued, but always with the sense that the next shadow might fall upon the river at any moment. When summer came, the forests grew thick with green, and the air turned heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The river no longer ran icy, but broad and strong, reflecting the sun in quicksilver flashes. It was in this season that the people fished most, setting out in small dugout canoes to cast their nets. Life seemed momentarily gentler, softened by warmth, yet the memory of the last raid sharpened every sense. One evening, as the sun dipped low, men returned from the river with news that chilled the air despite the season. They had seen smoke upriver, too much to be from hearth fires, too dark to be from brush burning. It was the kind of smoke that spoke of ships repairing their tar, of iron heated in strange forges. The river was carrying a warning. Again, preparations began. But this time, there was more than readiness. There was invention. Younger men suggested new traps, new ways of bending the river to their will. They dug channels that would guide ships into shallows. They set snares of woven rope beneath the surface, designed to catch oars and snap them mid-stroke. They planted sharpened poles not only along the banks, but also beneath the cover of lily pads, so that what seemed like quiet water hid jagged death. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to place your hope not in open battle, but in shadows and patience? To know that your very survival depends upon remaining unseen until the final breathless moment. The Slavs lived within that quiet edge, where silence was sharper than steel. Days passed. Scouts slipped silently through the forest, eyes always fixed upon the horizon. And then, one morning, the first sail was seen. Dark against the light of dawn, it slid across the bend with a grace that belied its menace. Behind it came another and another, until the river seemed filled with dragons of wood and iron. The villagers moved without words. Each person knew their place, their duty. Archers settled behind their screens. Men crouched low by the stakes, their hands gripping ropes slick with pitch. Women pulled children back into the huts, though even there the little ones pressed their faces to cracks in the wood, wide-eyed, sensing that the air outside was trembling with something vast. The ships entered the bend, their oars rising and falling in steady rhythm. The raiders' voices carried over the water, laughter mingling with commands. To them, the river was only a path, a highway of conquest. They did not know it had teeth. The first rope tightened. An oar snapped like a brittle twig. A man shouted, clutching the splintered wood. The current pushed the ship sideways, dragging it toward the stakes. Panic spread along its deck, shouts rising as another vessel collided against it. From the banks, the first arrows flew. They cut through the air with soft, deadly whispers, striking shoulders, throats, arms. Some raiders lifted shields, but the next moment, their ships lurched again as the hidden traps beneath the lily pads caught their hulls. Men stumbled, falling into the water, their armor dragging them down before they could cry out. Flames bloomed. Pitch-soaked arrows struck sails, which caught like dry grass. Smoke poured into the mist, black and curling, blotting out the sun. The river became a battlefield of fire and foam. Screams muffled beneath the roar of water and the crack of splitting wood. But even amid the chaos, some raiders fought hard. They leapt ashore with axes, their eyes wild, their beards bristling with foam. The villagers met them with spears, with sharpened poles, with stones pulled from the earth itself. Each blow was desperate, but steady, for they fought not for glory, but for the soil beneath their feet, for the huts behind them, for the river that had raised them. When it was done, the river bore scars. Charred planks floated among reeds. The water was streaked with ash, with oil, with a strange glimmer of steel. The villagers stood weary but unbroken. The raiders had been swallowed again, consumed by traps they never saw until it was too late. That night, the village sat together. Bowls of stew were passed, though few ate with appetite. Faces glowed in the firelight, shadows deep beneath tired eyes. Dobroslav spoke once more, his voice softer now. The river remembers. Each time we feed it, it grows stronger. But remember this, our strength is not in killing, but in surviving. The river teaches us patience, teaches us cunning, and teaches us to endure. The people listened. They did not cheer, nor did they boast. They sat in silence, hearing the river outside, the slow lap of water against the bank. And in that sound, they heard both warning and comfort. Seasons would turn again. The river would freeze, thaw, flood, and narrow. Ships would return, as surely as spring itself. Yet the Slavs would remain, patient in their silence, clever in their traps, steady in their faith that rivers could protect as fiercely as they provided. The moon rose high, silver across the current, and the mist returned to wrap the banks like a veil. It was as though nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Summer deepened, and the river widened with warmth, its waters reflecting the sun in bright shivers of light. Along the banks, reeds grew tall and green, whispering in the breeze, and dragonflies darted between them in flashes of color. Life returned to the village as if it had never been interrupted, though beneath the surface of every smile, every chore, lay the memory of smoke and steel drifting upon the current. The men turned again to their fields, bending over rows of rye and barley that swayed in the wind like small armies of green. Women wove baskets from willow, the steady creak of their weaving echoing through the air, while children gathered berries in the forest, their mouths stained red with juice. Cows grazed upon meadows, their bells ringing gently with each step, and the village, in its rhythm, seemed calm. Yet calm was never fully trusted. The river carried more than fish and silt. It carried rumor. Traders who paddled upstream in smaller boats told of raids upon other settlements, of villages set aflame, of captives dragged away in chains. Some said the raiders came from the north, others from the sea. Still others claimed they were spirits in the shape of men, immune to hunger and fear. Each tale spread like smoke, curling through the huts, settling in hearts that already knew too well the weight of dread. At night, the sky filled with stars so dense they seemed like spilled grain upon black cloth. Families gathered by their fires, telling stories both to distract and to remind. One tale was of a hunter who once struck down a wolf only to find, as he drew closer, that it was a man in wolfskin, punished by spirits for his greed. Another told of rivers themselves turning against invaders, rising high and sweeping them away as easily as a hand brushes crumbs from a table. These stories, half believed, half feared, wove themselves into the air until they became almost as real as the traps in the river. Dobroslav, the elder, leaned upon his staff as he told the children that their ancestors had lived by rivers since the world was young. He said that every bend, every stone, every hidden pool held memory, and that if one listened closely, the water would whisper its secrets. His voice was steady, though his eyes drifted often toward the horizon, as if even he wondered how long the river's protection could last. And so life continued, balanced on the edge between ordinary tasks and quiet vigilance. Men went hunting for boar in the forests, their spears tipped with iron, their movements silent among ferns. Women brewed mead from honey gathered in woven skeps, sweet and golden, a gift they offered to guests and to spirits alike. Children learned the art of knots, of bowstrings, of shaping clay into vessels that would carry grain through winter. Yet always, the river remained the center. One late afternoon, as clouds piled high in the sky and thunder muttered in the distance, a fisherman returned from his nets pale-faced and trembling. He had seen, far downriver, the shapes of longships once more, their sails patched from past battles, their oars dipping in unison. Though still far, they were coming. The village gathered. The smell of storm hung heavy, sharp with ozone, as the people spoke in low tones. The traps had been rebuilt, sharpened, hidden anew. But each raid brought new dangers. What if the raiders had learned? What if they had seen through the mist, guessed at the snares? The night fell, with rain drumming upon thatch and earth, soaking the soil, swelling the river. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the bend where the traps lay hidden. Men huddled beneath cloaks, checking ropes, adjusting stakes, whispering prayers. Women kept the hearths burning, offering bread to the spirits of water, hoping that kindness would be repaid in protection. At dawn, the ships came. Their hulls gleamed wet, their sails heavy with rain. Oars rose and fell, cutting through the current, steady and certain. The raiders' voices rose, rough and guttural, carrying across the water. They had come not with hesitation, but with purpose, as if daring the river to stop them. The traps were ready. Logs waited, submerged in silence. Stakes stood sharp and unseen. Archers crouched low, their strings taut, their eyes narrowed. The first ship struck. A sudden jolt, the sound of timber scraping timber. Men staggered on deck, shouting in confusion. Another vessel crashed against a submerged log, its hull splitting open as water poured in. The raiders roared, lifting shields, drawing blades, but the current dragged them sideways, pressing them toward the waiting points. Arrows flew. They hissed like insects, finding gaps in armor, piercing flesh. Flames burst as pitch-soaked shafts ignited sails. Smoke mingled with rain, drifting across the water in choking clouds. Some raiders leapt overboard, but their heavy iron dragged them beneath, and the reeds closed in around them like a cage. Yet this time, the raiders did not scatter so easily. They fought with a new fury, perhaps driven by vengeance for those lost before. Some ships turned sharply, avoiding the traps, and their men leapt ashore. Axes swung, biting into wood and flesh alike. The villagers met them, spears thrusting, stones flying from slings. The air filled with cries and the dull thud of blows. For hours, the struggle raged. Rain poured, turning the earth to mud, making every step treacherous. The river boiled with wreckage, with burning planks carried away by the current. The smell of smoke and blood hung heavy, clinging to the skin. At last, the raiders faltered. Their numbers dwindled, their ships broken. Those who could fled downriver, their oars splashing frantically, leaving behind a trail of ash and ruin. The village stood battered but unbroken. Many bore wounds, some deep, some shallow. Fires smoldered in the rain, hissing as they died. The river carried the last of the wreckage away, its surface slowly calming, as if nothing had ever happened. That night, the people sat in silence. Bowls of broth were passed, but few tasted it. The children, exhausted, slept quickly, though their dreams stirred with cries they had heard. The elders spoke softly, reminding them that survival itself was victory. And when the fire burned low, Dobroslav raised his staff once more. "The river has teeth," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor of age. "But teeth alone are not enough. We must listen. We must learn. Each time they come, we must be wiser. For the river remembers, but so do our enemies." The people nodded. They knew he was right. The river had saved them again, but it could not be trusted blindly. Each season, each raid, would demand new cunning, new patience, new traps woven into the heart of the water. Outside, the rain eased. The stars emerged once more, faint but steady, reflected in the wide, dark current. The river flowed on, silent, endless, carrying memory, like a secret buried deep beneath its surface. The rain ended, but its scent lingered, damp and earthy, rising from the soil in slow breaths. For days after the battle, the land seemed to weep, the meadows soaked through, the huts dripping steadily as though wringing out the storm. The villagers moved quietly, carrying the weight of both relief and sorrow. Some gathered reeds to repair roofs. Others fetched water in clay jars darkened by soot, while men with bandaged arms sat at the river's edge, staring into the current as if it alone held the answers. Life returned cautiously, though not unchanged. In the mornings, smoke curled once again from hearth fires where millet porridge thickened, and in the evenings, voices rose in subdued song. not loud enough to call attention, but strong enough to remind each other that they endured. Chickens scratched through wet earth for worms. Dogs sniffed cautiously around the ashes of burned timber, and children, restless, began once more to chase one another through the tall grass, their laughter fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. Dobroslav, the elder, walked slowly between huts, leaning on his staff, his eyes scanning not just the village, but the faces of its people. He spoke little now, though many sought his presence. At dusk, he would sit near the river, dipping the staff into the water, letting ripples spread outward. When asked what he read in those circles, he only said, "The river is not finished speaking." The traps had done their work, but everyone knew the raiders had learned as well. This time, they had pressed harder, fought longer, nearly broken through. The victory was not clean, not without cost. Fresh graves were dug on the hill beyond the meadow, marked with simple wooden posts, each carrying a small carving of spirals and runes meant to guide the spirits onward. Women laid herbs upon the mounds, wormwood, thyme, and rue, while children watched in silence, understanding death not through explanation, but through ritual. Summer stretched on, heavy with heat. The river shimmered beneath the sun, its surface broken by the occasional flash of fish, its banks humming with insects. Work continued in fields and forests. Men felled trees, their axes ringing through the air, shaping beams for new huts. Women tanned hides in the shade, their hands stained with bark and water, the smell of smoke mingling with leather. Life was labor, but each task carried within it the undercurrent of vigilance. Have you ever wondered what it is to live with a shadow pressed always against your shoulder, even in moments of peace? To laugh, to plant, to harvest, yet never without listening for the distant beat of oars upon water? For the Slavic villagers, that was the rhythm of existence, joy braided with fear, love stitched with watchfulness. By late summer, scouts returned with word from upriver. The raiders were not gone. They had built a camp beyond the bend, a place where their ships rested on the banks, where fires smoked day and night. Some said they had brought slaves. Others claimed they were gathering strength for another assault. The villagers listened, their jaws tight. The river had given them warning, but no easy escape. A council gathered. Men sat in a circle, their spears laid beside them. Women listening close, children pressed into corners. Some argued they should strike first, slipping downriver in small canoes to set fire to the raiders' camp. Others feared such boldness, saying the river would betray them if they tried to turn predator rather than prey. Dobroslav lifted his hand, silencing them. "The river does not fight with haste," he murmured. "It flows, it waits, it wears stone to sand. We will be as the river." So they waited. Days turned, each one heavy with expectation. The raiders did not move, yet their smoke rose steady on the horizon. At night, the villagers watched the glow, faint but unyielding, like a second sun beyond the bend. They knew the enemy was there, breathing, sharpening, waiting. Autumn crept in slowly, painting the forests with gold and rust. The fields were harvested, grain stored in clay jars, sealed with wax, apples dried upon racks, honey poured thick into wooden tubs. The air cooled, and mornings came heavy with mist, so dense that even the nearest hut seemed swallowed by it. The river, cloaked in fog, became an endless mystery, its banks vanishing into whiteness. The villagers moved through this season with heightened care. Hunters who entered the forest left small carved markers upon trees, signs to guide them back, for the fog disoriented even those who knew every root and stone. Children were kept closer, their games confined to the village's heart. Fires burned lower, their smoke lost in the greater mist. And still, the raiders' camp smoked beyond the bend. Scouts reported fewer movements now, as though the men there had grown weary, or perhaps they too feared the mist. Some said sickness had spread among them. Others whispered that the spirits of the river had cursed them. The villagers did not know the truth, only that time was passing, and with each passing day, the threat remained. One morning, as the mist hung thick, a fisherman returned with strange news. He had ventured close to the bend and found the raiders' camp abandoned. The ships were gone, the fires cold, the ground littered with broken tools and scraps of cloth. It was as if they had vanished in the night. The village stirred with both relief and unease. Where had they gone? Would they return from another direction? Was their disappearance a trick, a test, another kind of trap? Dobroslav only shook his head. "The river has spoken," he said. "It has carried them away. But remember, it carries everything in circles. What leaves will return." The villagers repaired their traps nonetheless. They sank new logs, sharpened fresh stakes, wove thicker screens of willow and reed. They did not trust the silence. Silence was a mask, and beneath it, the river's teeth still waited. Winter approached. Frost gathered along the edges of roofs. Breath clouded in the mornings, and the fields lay bare beneath pale skies. The river slowed, its surface touched with ice that thickened day by day. Villagers wrapped themselves in furs, lit fires early, and gathered close in the evenings to tell stories that bound them to the past and steadied them for the future. The traps beneath the water slept beneath ice, unseen, untouched. Yet even in sleep, they remained sharp. The villagers knew that when the thaw came, the river would wake once more, and with it, the threat. For in the rhythm of years, nothing ended. Everything returned, flowing as the river flowed, ceaseless, patient, endless. Winter settled fully, not with a single storm, but with a patient tightening of the world. Each dawn, the frost traced finer filigree along the hut doors and the rims of wooden pails. Each dusk, the smoke from the hearths rose straighter into the iron sky, as if the air itself had stiffened. The river grew a skin first, then a shell, then a body of pale stone, its old voice muted under layered ice. When oxen were led to drink, their breath plumed and fell, and the sound of their hooves across the shore broke like brittle porcelain. Men carried augers to bore small holes, not for boats now, but for lines, lowering bait into the cold black beneath, their mittens stiff with frost and their cheeks chafed red. The children learned to step lightly, to follow the elders' footprints in single file, because the river, gentle in summer, could still, even now, choose to take a careless foot. In those close rooms of winter, life folded inward. Women combed flax with iron teeth and spun thread that sang softly through fingers. They dyed wool with onion skins and alder bark, so the cloth kept the brown and amber colors of the forest that slept outside. The boys shaped arrow shafts beside their fathers, sighting along each one, shaving by the fire's glow until the line was straight as a vow. Dobroslav's staff stood propped by the door of his hut like a third leg of the building itself, its carved spirals burnished by many hands. He grew slower, but his voice did not. When the children begged for a tale to distract them from aching fingers and humming feet, he spoke. Not grand epics shouted into the firelight, but the small, steady stories that taught the bone what to do before danger even arrived. He told of Kolyada, and so the village prepared. Have you ever wondered how a people keep hope warm when the earth goes still? They do it with a feast the color of embers. On the longest night, doors were marked with chalk, and straw was scattered under tables to remember the stable places where life begins. Honey cakes were pressed with sun circles and carried to the thresholds. A sip of mead was poured onto the snow for the ones beyond the veil. The elder boys painted their cheeks with ash and wore masks plaited from birch bark to wander the lanes in a quiet procession, not to frighten, but to nudge laughter awake. Mirina, the herb wife with hair the color of last year's wheat, fastened sprigs of juniper above cradles and stuffed pillows with dried thyme to sweeten dreams. Between songs, she checked the healing of wounds taken in summer, rewrapped an old spear gash with warmed honey and linen, and blew softly upon a toddler's brow to ease a fever that rose and fell with the moon. Outside the feast, work went on. The traps were wintered like animals, inspected, stroked into readiness, fed with thought. Men cut willow in the snow-latticed thickets, their knives bright and quick, and shaped it by the hearth steam into curved screens that would vanish into the reeds when spring returned. By day, they hauled sledges to the river and dropped wicker baskets filled with stones through auger holes, marking with sticks where each weight sank. These would lie in lines the water remembered and the eye forgot, guiding the current later as a shepherd guides a flock. By night they sketched too, not on vellum, but in ash upon the packed earth floor. A bend of river traced with a charred stick, a narrow where the ice always thinned first, a place where every spring a log drifted and lodged like a faithful hound. Here, one younger man, Radomir, tapped the ash with his fingertip. When the thaw comes, the first ships will edge this way to avoid the shoal. If we stake beneath the melt and lash a rope to that birch, the water's pull will do the rest. Dobroslav nodded, eyes reflecting flame. Be as the water, he said. Give, then take. And then there was the forge. Not a grand place of wheezing bellows and city anvils, but a low-roofed shed where charcoal and bog ore met heat that glowed dull as a sleeping fox. Mislav, the smith, worked with sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the cold, his breath a rhythm to the rasp of file and the ring of hammer. The raiders had left gifts they never meant to give: warped nails, torn rings of mail, bent spearheads, little corners of iron shaken loose by the river's teeth. He melted and folded and beat these fragments until they forgot their first shape and learned another, flattening to barbs, drawing out to hooks, punching rivet holes in small plates that would be sewn to stout leather and worn beneath a tunic where eyes could not see. Iron remembers, he murmured to the tongs, but it can be taught to remember differently. Mirina watched him sometimes, bringing broth whose steam scented the forge with garlic and dill. They spoke little. Words were dear in winter, and too many would fog the mind as surely as breath fogged the air. Yet when she left, she brushed a lock of hair from her cheek and paused by the threshold, listening to the muffled creak of river ice. It shifts while we sleep, she said, not to Mislav, not to anyone, perhaps to the night itself. It practices. By midwinter, the sky had taken on that faint green glass quality born of cold that will not give. Wind polished the drifts till they shone. Smoke rose like thin threads woven into the clouds. The village marked Giatti with bowls set out at doorways. Porridge, a heel of bread, a small square of lard, so that the visiting ones would not leave hungry. Women burned a braid of flax as an offering and warmed stones at the hearth to place in beds, where their heat would pretend to be another body's. The old man's voice grew hoarser, but still he called the children to the threshold. Listen, he told them, to what does not speak. The river under ice is your mother speaking through a wall. You still hear if you learn the sound of her breath. They pressed their ears to the frozen sheet and widened their eyes when a deep groan ran through it, like a bull lowing in some buried field. In such days, thought itself becomes a kind of weaving. Radomir, whose idea had traced the ash river on the dirt, went off into the birch above the true bend and spit quietly before touching his hand to its bark. He would test the strength of the rope on which so much rested, not by yanking, but by leaning, letting his weight teach him. Ilya, the boy who once had run breathless with the first sight of sails, traveled with him. His legs were longer now, and his glance less darting. He had learned the patience of water watching, how a drift of snow thins sooner over a hidden current, how a mist-colored patch means a reed bed below. They cut narrow ladders from saplings and left them cached under snow near the bank, for quick use when the thaw cracked the edge and someone's foot slipped, because traps set for others can sometimes open their mouths for the hand that sets them. Have you ever wondered how a people forms one body without ever deciding to? It is done this way. The woman who pours a thimble of mead on the sill before a baby's first step. The hunter who leaves fish guts far from shore, so foxes are satisfied and do not nose the smoke pit. The girl who hums to the beehives even though the bees are torpid knots of winter. Each knits a thread that strength can travel. When danger comes, nothing new must be invented. What is old simply stands up. Danger does not always arrive like a shout. This time, it announced itself as a line of crows that wheeled and settled upon the black ribs of a fallen elm near the downriver bend. Marina saw them first through the pale afternoon and narrowed her eyes. Crows are mirrors. They gather where the world is about to turn. She wordlessly filled her basket with dry rushes and walked as if to gather kindling. Close to the bend she crouched, her breath small, and watched the far bank until a shape parted the alder thicket. A shape that did not move like deer. A man's cloak, stiff with frost. Another, carrying an axe awkwardly as if borrowed. Then a child, thin as sapling, not one of theirs. The raiders? Number these were scavengers drawn by the summer wreckage, or those driven from some far fire to test softer places. Yet farther behind, beyond a hummocked rise, the taller tops of masts. Not many, not the fleet that made villages swallow their singing. A fore-party feeling the edge of the land. Marina did not run back. Running roils the river, even if the river is frozen. She walked, tapping the rim of her basket with a little willow switch, so that those who saw might think only of fuel. At the village edge, she set the basket down to warm her hands over a brazier. To Dobroslav, she said only, "Our crows are hospitable. They make room for guests." His eyes narrowed, but he did not rise in alarm, only drew the children into a tale of the fox who stole the sour cream, and then gave a fish in repayment the next spring. While his voice threaded the air with harmless sound, Radomir and Ilya slipped away to the birch. They lay upon their bellies at the river's lip, chins numb, and peered through a hole where earlier a line had been lowered. Under the ice, the slow black moved, as if thinking. Ilya set his ear to the white and cocked it, listening for the hollow beat of oars. There was not yet that rhythm, only the deeper groan of shift and settle, the long whale sigh of the season itself. "They are not upon us," he whispered. "They nose around the bend, like wolves deciding where to test the fence." "We will make them choose our gate," Radomir said. They dragged the cached ladders into place, one here, one farther down, where they knew the ice thinned near a spring. They cut 2 more holes, not where men would step, but where ropes would be fed later, the ends looped and hidden under drifts. Then at the birch, Radomir knelt and passed a roughened palm over the hemp he had spliced with Mislav's careful eye. The rope was thick but supple, a river snare in waiting. He had fixed to it, at intervals, small hooks of iron like the teeth of a patient fish. In the flood, these would catch and hold against the current. In the thaw, they would begin their work. A thaw gives no trumpet, only a softness at the doorframe and a droplet that forms then falls from the eave like a small bell. One late day it happened. The world did not warm. It loosened. From the lower meadow rose a smell as old as breath. Wet earth, remembering grass. The river under its crust changed its voice. The children, forbidden for weeks from walking alone near the banks, were kept even closer now. The ice was a rumor of strength laid over a certainty of depth. Downriver, the prow tops winked. 3, then 4, then vanished like muskrats shifting between channels. Not a great threat, but a testing tooth. The villagers moved without the theater of alarm. Mislav hung his leather shirt of little plates beneath his wool and looped a cross strap over his shoulder so the weight would not bite the same place for long. Mirena packed a roll of bandage, a clay pot of salve the color of caramel, a bone needle, and a charm. 2 grains of wheat inside a sprig of rue tied with thread. Dobroslav pressed his lips to the end of his staff as if to an old friend's knuckle and stood in his doorway, blocking out the light for a moment with his tall shadow, then stepping forward where the ground was firm. Ilya slung a sack of stones for the sling at his belt. Radomir spat once more and touched the birch. The first of the 4 party came on foot, picking the shore with care, axes high, but steps unsure on the sugared crust. They did not know the lines underwater, the baskets of stones, the way the current leaned. When they reached the bend and saw, far off, the driftwood and dead reeds stacked oddly where the bank dipped, a place a careless eye might call a path, they changed course without thinking. The path bowed gently under their weight. It was not earth. Woven willow, pulled tight by winter, pretended to be bank until the 3rd step. The break was not a dramatic swallow. It was the sigh of a mouth finally opening. 2 men went through at once, and the cold took them without cry. One scrambled, his axe scoring the white as his legs bicycled in the black below. Ilya's sling snapped, a stone cracking the wrist that held the axe. The tool skittered and slid toward the birch, where Radomir's rope already, gently, invisibly, moved. He had cast it earlier from the higher bank into the slacker water, and now paid it out through the hidden auger hole, drawing it a finger's breadth at a time the way a man who loves horses draws a nervous mare to his hand. Beneath the ice, the hooks found their first purchase, a root, a remnant of last summer's steak, the frayed fringe of a submerged log. The rope's belly curved, then straightened. When the oars came, as they would, the water would choose the rope's way, and the boats would follow the water. And the boats did. Cautious, they tried the center channel, found ice too thick to nose, tried the outer, found it rotten and nudging them back. The rope's soft insistence and the basket's underwater weight shaped the choice as surely as a mother's palm shapes the tilt of a child's chin. When the first prow entered the false throat of the river, the men aboard relaxed, for there the surface was open, an easy lane black and inviting. They did not know that below it, willow weavers had made a harp. That harp had teeth. The oars dipped. The first 2 strokes were clean. The 3rd met hemp and iron. A blade caught and snapped back into a man's shoulder. Another skidded and threw its rower sideways. The boat yawed and nudged the stake line, where the thaw had loosened the ice just enough for the points to tilt up their faces, like sleepers waking and showing their teeth. A soft grinding, then the sound of planed wood suddenly chewing. Voices rose, not in a wave, but in short barks of surprise that grew into anger. Their anger was late. From the reeds, where no leaf yet hid a man's shape, arrows flew low and flat. One hissed into a calf. Another thudded into the raw spruce of the gunwale. Then another into the seam between a shoulder blade and a shield rim where iron could not reach. The boat behind tried to back water and tangled in the rope's next hook. It was not a great slaughter. This was not summer's blaze with pitch painted across the river and sails flowering into fire. This was winter loosening its grip and making everything slippery. The ships, the choices, the certainty. Two boats fouled, and one, pulled half sideways by the soft hand of the rope, ground its strakes on a stake's point until water began to lick over the lip like a cat's tongue. Men who jumped found the willow mats and tore through the skin of them into the black. Those on foot ran back the way they had come, along a bank that was no bank. A third boat, seeing, backed with quick, hard pulls, and escaped down the true channel, anger hunched in its shoulders like a crow. Silence did not follow, not at first. There were coughs, and the hollow drum of a hull striking ice, and the strange hollow sound men make when cold reaches their lungs and claims the speech there. Then the real quiet, when the only noise was the river learning to speak spring again. The villagers did not cheer. Mislav, shoulders set like a yoke across them, waded to the rope's end and drew it up with Radomir, the hooks ringing faintly against each other as if pleased to have worked. Mirena knelt where two men shivered on the bank and unrolled bandages as calmly as if she were wrapping cheese for storage, binding a gash without hurry, cutting a man's soaked boot free before his toes belonged more to frost than to him. She gave the captives, not raiders in helmets and iron, but the scavengers whose faces wore old hunger, 2 sips of hot broth and 1 hard stare. "You go," she said, when breath returned enough to carry sense, "but do not go with maps on your tongues." They nodded, not out of honor, but the mute agreement of those whom water has already judged. Dobrislav stood last, leaning into his staff, the points of his boots ringed with hoarfrost. He looked not at the men or the boats, but at the birch and the rope and the line of baskets under black. "It is not always the great fight," he said, so softly Radomir had to lean to hear. "Sometimes you take the hunger out of the teeth, and the mouth forgets to bite." He sank the staff's ferrule once into the thawing mud, as if to set a seal. When night came, it came with the delicate constant music of melt, a drip from eave to bucket, a tremble of icicle, a sigh as Snow's shoulder slid down from a fir bough and lay where it fell. In the huts, boots steamed by the fire, and mittens hung from pegs. Mislav oiled the rope and wound it into a loose coil that would not kink when asked again to behave like a river. Mirana set a pot at the hearth's edge where it would barely breathe rather than boil, letting bones yield their sweetness to the broth by degrees. Ilya, exhausted, traced with a charred stick on the hearthstone an arrow notched into the bend of a line, and smiled at the thought that water could be taught a letter and asked to read it. Before sleep, Dobroslav walked once more to the threshold of his hut and lifted his face into the night. A single star burned greenish above the river's course. He did not speak to it. He only listened, because the river under ice had a new voice, wider, easier, beginning to remember itself. He thought of years as rope, of seasons as knots. He thought of the next time iron would ride the water, and of the way this people would stand without stamping its feet. Far downriver, anger gathered itself into a plan in the bodies of men who had fled, the way storm gathers behind the rim of a hill. It would return, because that is how storm and men are. Between now and then lay a thaw, and a sowing, and a brief summer whose green would swell the heart and make the hands soft unless the mind kept them hard. Between now and then lay a marriage perhaps, and a birth, and an old man's last tale told in a voice thin as reed. There would be fish laid on racks, and honey lifted in its first gold from the comb, and a spindle whirring as if the air itself would be thread. And in the bend, the baskets would settle deeper into the mud, and the birch would root another ring of wood, and the rope would hang oiled and patient. Have you ever wondered whether a trap becomes part of the river after a while, the way a scar becomes part of a hand. There comes a point when you no longer know what was set by you and what was always there. The people slept between those questions, warm under wool and fur, while the thaw wrote its wet, careful script along the shore. The ice loosened its hold in small, secret ways at first, as if winter were testing how much of itself it could leave behind without being noticed. A drip formed on the eave and fell. Another followed and missed the same dark spot, making a second. Near the birch at the bend, a thin lens of water slid between white and black and whispered to the patient rope oiled by Mislav's hand. In the spring of 795, the river was not yet green, not yet bright with the little silver backs of fish, but it remembered its color and began to move toward it, one softened edge at a time. Children were kept away from the banks, which were all teeth and smiles, but they stood at doorways and leaned as far as mother's fingers allowed, eyes wide for the first clear water as if it were a guest arriving in a good cloak. The village loosened too. Doors that had been furs over beams were open to real air, and the smoke of hearths, braided with the smell of wet straw and damp dog, the honey that had hardened into a reluctant amber in winter, warmed and ran when it was asked. Marina laid out her bundles of last year's plants and sorted what had the right color still. Birch bark that could still lend a body's heat to a fever tremble, nettle seeds that woke blood from the ankles upward, dried colt's foot for cough. She pinched each leaf and listened to the small crisp sound it made. Some herbs die twice, and you learn to hear the second death. She took from a wicker box an effigy that had hidden all winter, sticks bound to a crosspiece and wrapped in a shriveled plait of straw. Its face had once been chalk, now pale and flaked. Marzana, she said so softly it did not feel like naming power, only acknowledging company. This figure would be carried later down to the water and let go into the current, or burned until winter both sank and rose, whichever it preferred to do in leaving. Men walked the fields in longer strides now, feeling the ground with the soles of their feet as much as with their eyes. Where the frost had heaved, they stomped the skin back down gently, like smoothing the wrinkled blanket of a sleeping child. Radomir and Ilya shouldered long poles and tested the earth not just for sowing, but for carrying weight. They sought the narrow paths that would be taken by legs not born here, because raiders learned to leave the river for half a mile where it was hard and then return to it, and the land must teach them manners along that walk. Where the path narrowed between twin hawthorns, they wove a low mat of willow under a sift of loose soil. Where anyone but a village foot would step, the mat would sag, not enough to break a bone, only enough to fold pride, to make a man look down in alarm, and then lift his eyes to find nothing at all comforting in the tall hush of willow wands. It should be an embarrassment, not a grave, Radomir said, and Ilya nodded, because shame makes noise a man cannot stop, and the river loved to hear that. Mislav, in his small forge that always smelled a little of rain and hot iron, melted the winter's patient hoard of scraps. The torn rings from raider shirts, the clumsy iron pegs from a ship's ribs that the water had worried free. He shaped them into quiet things, not swords. There was iron enough in the world for swords already. He made thin plates to sew inside a leather cap that looked like any hunter's hood, a kindness for the skull beneath it. He made small, three-tined forks a hand could throw into a rope's lay, where they would bite and not let go, and little bells not to ring for warning, but to ring for listening. If hung beneath the planks of a watchman's platform, the faintest thrum of a prow's push against the running current would tease them into answering long before the eye saw. trade returned downriver in small, brave boats that kept to the shoulder of the current like goats pick a cliff. A man from another village, whose name wore the sound of Polotsk on it, came with honey that tasted of linden and a slab of wax the color of old sunlight. He had news in his pouch, too, wrapped in the way he told it. They portaged now, he said, and looked at the ground, not at the faces around the fire. They leave their boats at the elbow and walk the shore for half a day to avoid the bend you taught the river to sharpen. They count their steps and mark trees and return with boats brought on poles. They are learning us. He did not need to say who they were. The river had only one they, large enough to make a man swallow in the middle of a sentence. Dobroslav listened with his eyes more than his ears. He had grown thinner in the winter, and the skin of his hands had the kind of translucence that happens to an old leaf still clinging in spring. But when he spoke, the room leaned toward him, as a plant leans toward the small square of sun. So, we will teach the shore, he said. We have talked too long to the water, and not enough to the dirt. He took his staff and went to the door, and the Polotsk man followed him. Not because he was told to, but because it felt like luck to walk in the elder's footprint. On the rise overlooking the bend, the old man stood a long while and said nothing at all. Ilya, behind him, learned that you can listen to a hill. Planting began on a day with thin blue in the sky, like a vein in pale skin. Women walked the furrows with baskets and scattered rye with that flat tossing motion that looks careless to a stranger and is in fact an oath carried fingertip by fingertip to each seed. Children ran ahead to stake out a scare line with twine and rags, and then were called back to be told, again, gently, to keep their shadows out of the furrows. Mirena dipped her fingers in ash and marked each foreheads with a dot for luck, and to make them feel noticed, which is a luck of its own. At the field's edge, Mislav set 2 posts and slung between them a cord tied to more of his tiny bells, and sat a while on his heels, listening to them not ring. Good, he said. When the wind came up in a rush, they answered. When the wind rested, they were quiet. He would move them later to the watch platform over the bend. Every instrument must be played before a concert. There were visits that had nothing to do with trade or traps. A woman from the next village came with a baby who would not sleep unless carried. Mirena wrapped the cloth differently under the mother's arm and showed her a way to cut willow bark so the tree would not sicken and the tea would be bitter enough to help. The mother laid a coin on the table, and Mirena slid it back with one finger and said, "Bring me the first handful of new nettle when it is high, enough to pinch, and I will be paid." The woman smiled, because that felt like a future arranged. A boy came with a bird's wing he had found, and Mirena told him it was owl, not because she knew by sight, but because the boy would hear night the next time he lay in bed and think about broad wings moving just behind the wall of dark. And sometimes hearing is a better gift than a name. Have you ever held your breath so you could hear something you did not yet know the shape of? The village did that each evening now, not in fear, but in readiness, as a birch might hold still, before learning which way the next wind means to bend it. The drowning of Marzana happened in a shallow place where the current would not take a child. The effigy's straw hair was rebraided with fingers that remembered their own first braids, and someone stuck 2 rowan berries where eyes might be just to make the children laugh, and someone else scolded lightly, because one should not mock what is leaving. The figure was set alight, not fiercely, but with dry twigs that gave it a careful crown of fire. Then it was lowered into the water, which took it as a host takes a bowl from a guest's hand and turns to set it down. The smoke went up and the char went down, and Marina watched the ripples meet and cancel and meet again. She leaves, she said, and will come back as wheat. There was bread already in the oven that had her future in it, round loaves pressed with the print of a spiral shell. Under the bread smell, traps took their new shape. Radomir traced lines on the earth, and then did not follow them. If we would trick them, who have learned our river, he said to Ilya, we must let them trick themselves. He did 3 things. None shouted, all gentle. First, he asked the children to lay a line of smooth stones along a not-quite path near the hawthorns, the kind of careful child work that makes a thing look official. Second, he moved a single beacon pole 1 man's height from where it had always stood at the ben's lip and told no one except Mislav, who adjusted the bearings of the watchman's bells to match. Third, he cut young reeds and thrust them into a narrow backwater so they looked, from a boat's height, like old reeds broken and therefore safe to nose through. He did not build new teeth. He moved the tongue. The Polotsk trader crossed again on his way home with wax exchanged for flax, and a story left as change. I heard of a place where they strung lines of gut between stakes under water, and when oars paddled through, the lines sang in the wood, and the men did not know what they heard, he said, and smiled, because a rumor well told is the kind of bundle a man knows how to carry. Do not believe all you hear, Dobroslav said, not unkindly, but listen to what it makes you think. Mislav toyed with a gut string that had once been a harp in someone's hand and tied it around his finger until the tip went white, then let go and watched the life slip back. Perhaps the river will learn to pluck, he murmured. Days warmed into a promise they did not hurry to cash. The grass lifted its face by grains. Bees flew in slow loops as if they were lessons set to music. The men took the dugouts down from where they had leaned all winter and rubbed their bellies with animal fat until the wood deepened into its own color and forgot the dryness. Ilya was allowed to paddle alone for the length between 2 alder stumps while Radomir kept pace on shore. He learned the little current tricks, not to fight the turn at the end of a stroke, but to let it place your blade for the next. A river is a conversation, Radomir said from the bank. Be polite, and it will tell you what it wants. The watchers on the platform kept their hours by the sun's slide down the inner edge of the notches Mislav had cut in a plank. At dawn, dew pearls sat on the bell tongues as if they had sung all night. By noon, the bells were dry. By evening, they were warm from heat that had climbed up the posts from the ground. And then, one afternoon, not bells, but air carried a change. A gull that never flew this far inland crossed once overhead and did not cry. The dogs lifted their heads together and set them back down, unsatisfied. The reeds at the backwater spoke quietly to one another when no wind deigned to answer. Radomir stood and did not have to say anything. Ilya was already at his side. They saw nothing at first, but they felt time arrhythming, the way a man who has marched a long way knows when a drum goes wrong 2 valleys away. Later, there were the specks of tar dark on the south lip of sky, then the fine grain of oars working, then the line of hulls like string pulled too taut. Not a great fleet, but more than the 3 and 4 of winter's test. Boats enough to think themselves a lesson others would learn from. They came not fast. They came measuring. They will walk some, Dobroslav said softly from where he stood with his staff like a nail in the world. They will let the shore do our work if the shore is careless. But the shore had practiced. The men who slipped out with axes to find the half-path between hawthorns found that path friendly at first. The stones the children had laid were smooth, and made a good rhythm for a foot. Hurrying is a blessing you offer to the one who waits for you. The mat sagged as if embarrassed to be discovered, and the men swore, and each swore not to tell he had stepped wrong first. They did not see, because no one ever sees, that their noise had awakened a flock of starlings in the thicket, and the starlings rose as one mind and moved as if they were a single robe shaken out before being put on. The hulls downriver saw that dark bloom and misread it as battle in the shallows, an edge to the backwater that had been dressed in reeds to look like a safe lane. Mislav's bells had learned when to be silent. The first boat slid in. The second followed because the first seemed pleased, and the third held back because the third belonged to a man whose mouth had lines at its corners from not smiling. He hesitated, and that saved him. It only saved him. At the water's lip, the changed beacon pole showed a notch to the left, where eyes wanted a notch to the right. An oar dipped wrong to correct a wrong that had not been made, and found, under its blade, the three-tined fork Mislav had lashed to the line Radomir had settled 2 days ago. The oar jerked. The man holding it, honorable by habit, did not let go at once. Pain respects honor less than fish do. He cried out, and the sound went up and across, like a thrown pale, flashing sun. Men on the bank, who were not villagers and not raiders either, but those who come to heavy moments to find what falls, heard the cry and rose and did not move. They had learned in winter that the river takes what is already leaning. What followed was not a blaze. It was a folding. The first hull nosed the false reeds and found the woven willow under the water, as soft as a beggar's bed, and as traitorous. Its prow did not lift in pride, but sank with a sigh of relief, as if tired of sharpness. The men behind scrambled on their planks, and their boots groped for an old winter skin that was no longer there to hold them. One boat bumped another and apologized by turning it the wrong way. The line of Gut Mislav had strung low between stakes, which he did not believe in until he heard it, thrummed, not a song, but the kind of tone you feel in your teeth. The watchman's bells answered, not to call the village, but to let the men on the platform count, without looking, how many hulls pushed water a hand's breadth inward from where safety had sat all last year. Arrows went as quietly as a person goes in and out of a sleeping room. No fire. It was not a night for fire. Iron already had its teeth at the men's ankles. A shaft knocked a helm's rim. Another took a shield's edge and made it spin against its owner's arm with a lover's force. It was the water that bit. A man who had never been taught by this river to roll with his armor to the side and let the weight do part of the climbing. He learned or did not. Those who gained shore found the earth less loyal than they hoped. Under the hawthorns, the shame mat took 2 more, and Radomir's hand at the sling made a sound like a beetle tapping a table, and a wrist forgot its strength and opened its hand. Dobrislav did not climb the platform. He stood at the Ben's crown and watched them go the way his stories said they would. We have not killed, he said at last, when the boats that still listened to themselves found the true channel again, and went away in a jerking line, like fish tied one by one on a stringer. We have not killed what would bring a larger anger before our barley has so much as thought of bread. We have taught. He sat, slowly, because sitting is an art. An old man must remember every spring as if new. Mirina came to stand behind him and rested her hand just below his shoulder as if the staff were not enough wood for that moment. Teaching is slower than killing, she said. So is bread. It was evening when the village took in breath again and let it out. The bread with the shell's print had the taste that always makes you say wheat, even when you know how much rye it holds. Ilya held his portion longer than most before eating, and looked at the crumb as if it were a letter from a cousin long away. "We will have to go look," he said, and he was right. In the next days, men would take the dugouts beyond the bend to find where feet had tried the shore and what they had written there, because the enemy leaves script, and you read it with your knees. For that night, though, he watched the shadow of the birch lie across the water like a promise and thought of the gut-string's small song. Have you ever wanted to hear something again that you know you should only want to have heard once? He felt that. When the dark deepened and the bells cooled from the day's sun, Mislav unstrung them and laid each on a folded rag so the night dew would not write rust tales in their cups. Mirena doused the last of the embers with a ladle of water and set the ladle down so gently it did not clink. Radomir checked the rope by the birch, not because it needed his hand, but because the hand needs to know what it will hold next time. Dobroslav slept as men sleep, whose years do not make bargains anymore. The river rolled its shoulder and remembered its color all the way down, and the village floated on that remembering as on a lullaby. Spring unwrapped itself in longer ribbons of light, each day carrying a little more warmth down through the black-soiled furrows and into the bones of the people. The field stirred, first with weeds, and then with orderly rows of green. Children learned again the art of chasing crows without frightening the grain, a balance of sound and movement that turned each boy and girl into a watchman of the earth. Their cries scattered dark wings into the sky, while behind them the women bent to pull grasses from between seedlings, their backs curved like bows, their hands steady in the soil. The rhythm of life returned to the land, yet every movement seemed sharpened by the memory of raiders' sails, as though the river's surface still bore the faint shadow of those boats, even when it lay calm beneath. The sun. Radomir and Ilya spent many mornings near the birch where the rope had sung its soft winter song. They checked the knots, shifted the baskets of stone that rested under the slow current, and marked new lines on the earth. They spoke less now, for words had become weight. Their companionship no longer required speech. A nod, the twitch of a hand, the tilt of a chin was enough to decide where to dig, where to set, where to listen. The younger boy's eyes had deepened, not with sorrow, but with an attentiveness that comes from watching the river's moods too closely. It is a strange thing to grow by water. You learn patience not from teachers, but from eddies. You learn that silence is not empty, but filled with choices. Mislav, in his forge, worked more than before. Spring freed him from the stiff iron of winter, and with a bellows sighing, he shaped blades not for war alone, but for life's continuity. New plowshares glimmered on the anvil beside spearheads. Knives for women's hands to slice flax lay beside small hooks for fishermen's nets. He kept aside, however, a secret collection of pieces. Barbed points that could be fastened quickly to poles, short iron teeth hammered flat and bent like fish hooks. These he tied into bundles and placed under the floorboards, saying nothing to anyone. He did not smile often, but when he did, it was with the quiet knowledge of a man preparing for the day he hopes will never come, yet knows surely will. Dobroslav still walked, slower than before, but his presence was as binding as the rope in the river. He spent more time with the children, speaking to them not in commands, but in stories that slipped lessons into their play. He told of how the beaver shapes the river, not by rage, but by patient cutting. He told of the swallow, who returns each year to the same nest and never loses her way, no matter how far she has flown. The children laughed at his voice, which cracked like dry reeds, but later they repeated his words to one another when they ran along the meadows, Even their games carried echoes of his counsel: mock ambushes in the reeds, little raids with willow spears, the building of tiny traps in the stream where minnows darted. The line between play and preparation blurred, as it always does when life itself is edged by danger. Have you ever felt the hum in the air before thunder breaks? The village felt such a hum now, though the skies remained bright. Scouts had walked farther than usual, their bare feet toughened by mud and root, and brought back tidings. There were new trails worn by strangers in the forests upriver. Birch bark had been cut from trees without reverence, left to bleed sap. A fire pit still warm had been found in a hollow, with fish bones scattered carelessly upon the ground. These were signs, and signs always wrote the same script. Men were near, men who did not belong, men who did not move like hunters or traders, but like wolves with a map in their heads. The council gathered at twilight. The men sat upon low logs, their spears resting against their knees, their faces gray in the fading light. The women joined them, for in times of peril every voice mattered. Children were hushed, though they pressed close to hear the shape of the future. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Radomir spoke first, his voice low. They are learning. They walk the land now, not just the water. Our snares must walk as well. Murmurs rose, for to set traps on the land was to admit that the river's guardianship was no longer enough. Yet Dobroslav nodded. The land is our child as much as the water. What we teach one, we must teach the other. Plans formed slowly, like roots spreading under soil. They decided to weave not only reeds and ropes, but paths of deception. New trails were to be cut, where the forest thickened, luring footsteps into bogs, where the ground itself drank men whole. Pits would be dug and lined with sharpened stakes, then covered with thin branches and leaves. Hunters promised to lead strangers with the sound of distant steps, drawing them into circles where the village's hands waited with spears. It was not a battle they prepared for, but a harvest. When the first true sign came, it was small. A dog barked in the night and did not stop. The villagers rose from their beds, eyes wide, hands clutching weapons. In the morning, they found the prints of boots near the edge of the field, heavier and broader than their own, and the imprint of a hand upon the soil where someone had crouched. No attack followed, but the air grew thinner, taut with expectation. The people moved about their days as though under a great weight. Even laughter seemed quieter, shortened, as though it might attract notice. Then, one morning, mist lay heavy upon the river, and within it moved shadows. Longships again, though fewer than before. Their prows cut the water silently, their sails slack with the lack of wind, their oars dipping in slow rhythm. The raiders had returned, not in vast numbers, but with the measured tread of men who believed they had learned from their defeats. They did not charge blindly into the bend. Instead, they halted upon a distant bank, sending smaller parties ashore. These men moved carefully, axes in hand, scanning the trees. They looked for traps as a fox looks for the hunter's snare. The villagers watched from behind screens of willow, their hearts steady though their breath grew short. They knew the raiders had learned, but so had they. The shore itself had been taught new tricks. When the raiders entered the false trail between the hawthorns, the earth bowed beneath them and gave way. A pit swallowed two, their cries muffled by the mud. Arrows hissed from the trees, silent and sure. The others scattered, retreating toward the bank, where more villagers waited with ropes stretched taut at ankle height. Men stumbled, fell, and the forest closed upon them. Meanwhile, on the river, the ships tested the current, probing as though wary of hidden teeth. The rope beneath the birch still slept in the water, its iron barbs ready, but this time it was not alone. Mislav had set his gut strings, fine and invisible, between submerged stakes. When oars dipped through them, the wood sang, a faint note that carried through the hull. The raiders shifted uneasily, for they did not know if it was their imagination or the voice of the river itself. Uncertainty is a weapon sharper than iron. The boats faltered, slowed, and in that hesitation, the archers loosed their shafts. It was not the great slaughter of summers past, nor the easy ambush of winter. It was something subtler, a weaving of fear into the enemy's flesh. Ships turned away before they struck the true traps. Men fled the forest without knowing how many pursued them. The river carried away their cries, muffling them in mist. By midday, silence returned. The raiders were gone, leaving behind a few bodies, a broken shield, and a trail of churned mud. The villagers did not rejoice. They sat in the dusk, eating slowly, speaking less. They knew what Dobroslav had said was true. Teaching was slower than killing. Each time the raiders came, they learned more, but so did the people. It was not victory they sought anymore, but endurance. Survival was not a single moment. It was a river, flowing, bending, never stopping. That night, Marina walked alone to the water's edge. She scattered a handful of rye into the current and whispered a prayer, not for herself, not for the village, but for the river. "Carry us," she murmured, "as you carry the silt, as you carry the stars, as you carry the dead." The water lapped softly, as if in answer. The moon rose, silver upon the current, and the mist gathered once more, cloaking the village in its embrace. Tomorrow would bring work again, and perhaps another shadow upon the horizon. But for that night, the people rested, breathing with the rhythm of the river. The days stretched into early summer, and the river grew fat with light. Its surface gleamed with long strokes of gold in the evening, and in the mornings it carried the pale green shimmer of willows bending to kiss their own reflections. Along its banks, flowers bloomed, yellow buttercups, purple vetch, the first white stars of meadowsweet, and their scent mingled with the thick sweetness of clover from the fields. Bees hummed like a steady drumbeat, weaving their paths between huts and hedges, while children darted in their shadows, chasing laughter through tall grass. On the surface, all seemed peaceful. Yet beneath the rhythm of the season, the village held its breath, never forgetting the slow tread of oars or the sudden cry of men lost to water. It was during this season that the villagers carried out the rituals of Kupala night, the midsummer celebration. Fires were built high on the meadow's edge, fed by branches of pine and oak. Young men leapt through the flames, their laughter ringing into the sky, while maidens crowned their hair with wildflowers, weaving daisies and cornflowers into bright garlands. They placed these crowns upon the water, watching them drift, and whispered the names of those they loved in secret. If the wreath floated steady, it meant devotion would endure. If it spun or sank, the heart would wander. Couples held hands and leapt together across the fires, testing whether their grip would hold in life as it did in ritual. The night shimmered with sparks and song, with laughter tempered by reverence, for all knew that the fires were also prayers, protection for crops, for cattle, for children, and for the unseen paths of fate. Dobroslav sat at the edge of the circle, his face lit by the flames, his staff resting across his knees. He no longer leapt, no longer sang, but his presence was a thread tying the night together. When the songs faded, he spoke softly, telling the story of Kupalo, the god of fertility, and his sister, Kostroma, who became the first mermaid when sorrow dragged her beneath the water. The children listened wide-eyed, shivering though the fire was hot. To them, the river was already full of ghosts and guardians, but Dobroslav's tale deepened the sense that every ripple carried not just fish, but memory. Have you ever stood by water at night, when firelight flickers across its surface, and felt that the river itself is awake, listening, reflecting not only stars, but the secrets of your own heart? The villagers felt that now, watching the garlands drift away into shadow. Their hopes floated with them, fragile and bright. Yet while they celebrated, while joy carried them through the shortest night, Radomir and Ilya slipped quietly to the watch post near the bend. They could not leave it unattended, not even for ritual. The bells Mislav had strung trembled faintly in the breeze, their tones too soft to disturb, yet sharp enough to warn of a prow's disturbance. They sat together, listening, speaking only rarely. Radomir traced patterns in the dirt with his knife, while Ilya watched the fires glow in the distance, wondering if the raiders who might be watching from beyond the forest could see it too. The days that followed Kupala were heavy with heat. The air shimmered above the fields, and the cattle gathered in the shade, flicking their tails against biting flies. Women carried jars of water from the river, their shoulders straining beneath the yoke, their brows wet with sweat. Men worked shirtless in the fields, their skin darkened by the sun, their backs bent over the grain. Even the dogs lay panting in the dust, tongues lolling, eyes half closed. The earth seemed to doze, but the people did not. The heat made them restless, irritable, more aware of every sound the forest made. One morning, a boy returning from the forest with a bundle of mushrooms came running, his breath sharp, his eyes wide. He had seen strangers, two men moving quietly, cloaked, carrying long knives. They had not seen him, or if they had chosen not to chase. The news spread quickly. Scouts followed the boy's path and found the faint trace of footprints near the edge of the marsh, along with the bones of a small fire half hidden beneath leaves. The raiders had returned, though they did not come openly with ships this time. They crept like foxes, probing for weakness. The council gathered again, this time beneath the shade of the birch, where the ground sloped gently to the river. Mislav spoke first. They learn. They come with fewer sails, with quieter steps. If we only set traps for ships, we will miss the teeth at our throats. Murmurs of agreement followed. Radomir added, then we must weave traps not just in water, but in air and soil. Every path, every trail they choose must be one we have already walked. So it was done. Pits were dug at the edge of the marsh, their mouths disguised with reeds. Narrow footpaths were seeded with thorn branches buried just beneath the soil. Hunters carried cords stretched between trees, invisible in the dusk, ready to pull taut when shadows moved too close. The forest itself became a labyrinth, one only the villagers could read. Dobroslav, too weak now to dig or weave, gave counsel instead. Let them not feel hunted, he said. Fear makes men dangerous. Let them think the land itself is their enemy. Let them stumble. Let them doubt. Let them waste their strength on shadows. His words were heeded, for he had lived long enough to know that killing a man is not always the same as defeating him. And so they waited again. Waiting was the true labor of the Slavs. It was not easy, not comfortable. It required stillness when the heart wanted to beat fast, patience when the mind wanted to shout. The days dragged heavy, but the people bore it, because they knew that patience was sharper than iron. The attack came not on the river, but on the land. One night, when the moon was thin and the air hung damp with heat, a small band of raiders crept through the forest. They moved silently, their boots muffled by moss, their eyes scanning every shadow. They were careful, more careful than before. Yet caution does not see what patience has sown. The first man fell into a pit, his cry cut short by the reeds. Another stumbled upon the thorns, his foot pierced, his stumble betraying his comrades. Then the cord snapped tight, tripping two more. In the darkness, the villagers rose from the undergrowth like the forest itself had grown them, silent, swift, merciless. Spears struck, arrows hissed. The raiders fought back, but they were tangled in confusion, hemmed by earth and tree. By dawn, the survivors had fled, limping, bleeding, their numbers broken. The villagers gathered their dead and wounded with quiet hands. No celebration followed, only silence and work. Graves were dug, wounds bound, traps reset. The air smelled of blood and pine, of sweat and damp soil. When the sun rose high, Dobroslav sat by the river and spoke softly, though no one was near. We are not hunters. We are not prey. We are the river. We endure. We bend. We wait. They will return as the seasons return, and we will be here as the river is here. His word carried on the breeze, mingling with the steady rush of water. The river flowed on, indifferent yet intimate, carrying silt, carrying memory, carrying the unending rhythm of life and death. The summer of 795 lengthened, and the world grew thick with sound. Frogs croaked in the marshes through the night. Bees drummed across the fields by day. And in the quiet between, the river spoke in endless tones, sometimes loud with foam, sometimes murmuring against the reeds. The village lived in that sound as one might live beneath a roof, safe, but always aware that weather could tear it away. The grain ripened under the steady sun, its stalks bending as if already heavy with bread. Children ran between furrows, chasing grasshoppers, their laughter mixing with the thrum of wings. Women baked flat loaves in clay ovens outside the huts, the smell of browning crust mingling with smoke and the sharpness of fermenting kvass in clay jars. Men scythed the hay meadows, their blades sweeping in long, even arcs, the cut grass falling with a hiss. It was a season of labor and of plenty, yet the people knew that fullness could vanish quickly, stolen by shadows on the water. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the river in bronze, a trader arrived from far downstream. He came in a narrow boat with a prow shaped like a fish, carrying salt, amber beads, and furs. His tongue carried the accent of distant lands, but his eyes held the same weariness of anyone who lived by the river's mercy. He shared news around the fire, of raids upon distant towns, of monasteries burned on the coasts where the sea met the land, of warriors in iron helms who came not for food but for silver, slaves, and glory. He spoke of names unknown to the villagers, kings and chieftains far beyond the forests. But his words planted unease. If such men could sail seas, surely no river was safe. The villagers listened, their faces shadowed in firelight. Radomir asked, "How far north?" The trader shrugged. "Farther than your eyes have seen, but not so far that their hunger will stop at your bend." Silence followed. Dobroslav tapped his staff against the earth. "Then the river must remain our teacher. It is not seas that save us, but patience and cunning." After the trader left, the people worked with renewed purpose. Mislav fashioned heavier hooks, sharper stakes, and plates of iron for shields. Women wove thicker ropes from hemp, testing them by hanging stones until the fibers groaned. The young men practiced with spear and sling, their arms growing steady, their eyes sharp. Even the children played differently, no longer chasing each other at random, but staging mock ambushes, shouting as they sprang from behind trees. Fear had shaped them, but fear had also taught them. Have you ever noticed how fear, when shared, can become a kind of thread that binds rather than frays? The villagers felt it so. They moved with more unity than before, each task echoing another, like notes in a song that grows stronger with repetition. The river itself seemed to sense their vigilance. Its waters swelled with late summer rains, carrying branches and debris that snagged on the hidden traps. The villagers took this as a sign. as if the river were rehearsing for the next test. Children brought offerings of flowers to cast upon the current, while Myrena scattered handfuls of salt and whispered to the water's spirit. "Carry what is heavy away from us," she prayed, "and leave behind only what we need." It was during this restless season that the raiders came again, not in the creeping silence of winter, nor in the probing steps of spring, but in the open glare of summer, when the fields were full and the village most vulnerable. The first warning came from a shepherd who had driven his flock to graze on the meadow's edge. He saw black sails far upriver, too many to count, their shapes sharp against the horizon. His cry echoed through the fields, and soon the village was a storm of motion. Women hurried to hide children in the forest, leading them by narrow paths marked only by stones. Men seized weapons, their hands trembling not with fear, but with readiness. Fires were doused, leaving the huts dark. The dogs were leashed, their mouths pressed shut by gentle hands. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant drum of oars. The ships came with a slow confidence. Their prows, carved like beasts, glared at the banks. Their sails sagged in the still air. Their oars dipped with the rhythm of hearts that did not doubt themselves. The raiders sang low, their voices like gravel, believing themselves lords of the water. They did not know the water had already chosen sides. The first ship entered the bend, cautious yet steady. Its hull brushed against a submerged log and scraped. Men shouted, adjusting their oars. A moment later, the rope hidden beneath the current caught. Barbs bit wood, and the prow jolted sideways. Confusion spread like fire in dry grass. The second ship, close behind, swerved and struck the first, oars snapping, men tumbling. The gut strings hummed, faint but eerie, as if the river itself sang. The raiders glanced around, unnerved, their confidence cracking. Arrows hissed from the reeds, swift and silent. One man fell with a cry. Another dropped his shield. The raiders raised their own bows, but the mist rising from the warm river bent their vision. More ships entered the bend, pressing into the chaos. The water foamed with shattered oars, with broken cries. Radomir stood at the birch, gripping the rope, his muscles straining as he guided it tighter, forcing the hulls together. Ilya, at his side, loosed stones from his sling, each one striking with the precision of long practice. Mislav appeared at the bank with his forged hooks, casting them into the tangle, pulling planks free, letting the water rush into hulls. The battle was fierce, though not loud. The villagers fought with silence, with patience. The raiders shouted, but their cries were swallowed by mist and reeds. Some tried to leap ashore, but pits awaited them. Thorns tore their legs. Ropes tripped them into the waiting spears. The forest itself seemed to close, each tree another trap. When it ended, the river carried away more than timber. The water ran dark with ash and blood, its current dragging broken shields downstream. Survivors fled, their ships half sunk, their voices lost. The villagers emerged slowly, their faces grim. They had won, yet victory was never sweet. Bodies lay tangled in reeds, and the air smelled of iron and smoke. That evening, the village gathered in silence. Bowls of stew passed from hand to hand, though few ate. Dobrislav raised his staff. His voice was frail, but steady. "We are not conquerors," he said. "We are guardians. The river is not ours. It is we who belong to it. Remember this. As long as we live as the river lives, we will endure." The people listened, their hearts heavy yet strong. They knew the raiders would come again, perhaps with more ships, perhaps with new cunning. But they also knew that patience, that endless thread of waiting and weaving, would always be their greatest weapon. The river flowed on beneath the moon, carrying both the memory of death and the promise of life, whispering in its endless voice that survival is not the shout of battle, but the quiet breath of those who remain. autumn settled with a softness that belied its danger. The fields, newly shorn, bore the smell of cut straw and drying grain. The air held a sharp edge in the mornings, crisp enough to sting the nose, while by midday the sun still pressed warm against the back. Geese wheeled overhead in long arrows, their calls falling like questions into the quiet below. The villagers stored their harvest in clay jars and wooden bins, sealing them with wax, mud, or woven lids. The sound of the scythe had ended. Now came the sound of grinding stone against stone as women turned grain into flour, their steady rhythm echoing from hut to hut. Yet with every task completed, every loaf baked, every sheaf stored, an unease threaded itself through the people. The raiders had left in broken ships, yet none believed their hunger had ended. The river was not only a path of retreat, but a path of return. In the hush of evening, when the mist rose heavy across the water, villagers found themselves staring into its depths, waiting, as if the pale smoke might thicken into sails. Dobroslav, older still, had grown quieter. His steps faltered more often, his eyes clouded with the veil of years. Yet he listened as though the river spoke only to him. Children came to his side, tugging at his sleeves, asking for stories. He gave them not tales of glory, but parables wrapped in patience. The squirrel, he said one evening, stores nuts not because he fears hunger, but because he knows hunger will come. He does not boast of his pile, he simply waits. Be like the squirrel. Store not only grain, but silence. It will feed you when clamor comes. Mirina, the healer, tended to the wounded who had not yet fully mended from the last ambush. She washed their cuts with bitter herbs, wrapped them in linen, and pressed clay pots of ointment into hands that trembled. You must not return to the field too soon, she scolded gently. A wound unhealed is a door left open. Yet she knew that men could not be kept idle long. They rose even when their flesh burned, because to sit while others worked was to let guilt gnaw at the heart. Radomir spent more time by the birch at the bend, the place where rope and river had become one. He sharpened stakes, shifted baskets, mended cords. Ilya, taller now, followed like a shadow, his boyhood nearly swallowed by the seriousness that danger carves into the young. They spoke less, for silence had become its own language. A raised brow, a shift of the hand, a twitch of rope meant more than any string of words. Together, they read the water, the swirl that showed where current quickened, the faint discoloration where silt revealed a hidden snag, the subtle rhythm of ripples that betrayed something moving against the flow. Have you ever noticed how waiting can change the very air? The village lived inside such waiting, as if each breath must be measured against an unseen clock. The fields were safe, the granaries full, but sleep came fitful. Dreams carried the thud of oars, the hiss of arrows, the splash of bodies falling into dark water. It was during such a night that the first sign came. A faint sound, distant but unmistakable, the soft thrum of oars, not the few strokes of a fisherman, but the deep, measured rhythm of many men pulling together. The bells on the watchposts trembled faintly, their tones lost to most ears, but sharp to the watchers. A runner carried word, swift and silent. Fires were banked, children gathered into hidden huts, dogs muzzled to keep them from barking. The village became a shadow of itself, still and waiting. From the mist, the long ships emerged. More this time, 5, then 6, their prows sharp against the night. They did not charge into the bend as before. They paused, their oars lifting, dipping, lifting again, as though feeling the river's skin with cautious fingers. The raiders had learned. They knew the river had teeth. The first ship sent a smaller boat ahead, a scout with only a few men. They rowed carefully, eyes darting, ears straining. They saw no traps, heard no hum of gut strings, no sudden groan of rope. The water lay still, the reeds silent. They turned, waving to the larger ships, signaling safety. But safety had been crafted from silence. Beneath the current, Radamir's new snares lay hidden, not where the raiders expected, but farther along, where the bend widened, where the enemy's guard would drop. The smaller boat passed unharmed, returning with its message. The long ships followed, one after another, cautious but convinced. When the first hull reached the wider stretch, the river answered. A line of weighted baskets shifted, tugged by the current, pulling a rope taut. Hooks caught wood. The ship jolted. Men shouted, scrambling to adjust. A second rope, laid at an angle, tightened, spinning the hull sideways. Chaos spread. Oars snapped. Shields clattered. The next ship rammed into its stern, splintering both. From the banks, arrows flew. Not a storm, but a steady rain, each shaft finding its mark. Raiders raised shields, but the mist bent their sight. Stones from slings whistled, striking helms, breaking arms. Spears thrust from the reeds, sharp and sudden. The river boiled with panic. Men leaping overboard, only to find themselves tangled in thorns hidden beneath the surface. The villagers fought not with fury, but with patience. Each strike was measured, each movement practiced. The raiders, caught between water and shore, could not find footing. Their cries echoed, then dimmed, swallowed by the night. By dawn, the river carried wreckage downstream. Planks, shields, bodies floated together, a grim offering to the current. Survivors fled in broken ships, their sails torn, their numbers thinned. The village emerged slowly, their faces drawn, their hands trembling from the long stillness. They had won again, but victory felt heavy. That evening, Dobroslav sat by the fire, his voice weaker than before. Each time they come, they learn, he said, and each time, so must we. The river teaches us not to be still water, but flowing water, always moving, always changing. His staff slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the earth. Radomir caught it, placing it gently back. The old man smiled faintly. One day, the staff will pass, but the river will not. Remember that. The people bowed their heads. They understood. Survival was not only in traps or weapons, but in memory, in the weaving of patience into each generation. The moon rose over the quiet water, silvering the mist, and the river flowed on, carrying both death and life as it always had. The year wore itself thinner with every leaf that browned and fell into the river. Autumn deepened, and with it came a different kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of watching. The hush of the forest when animals sense the hunter. The stillness of a field before a storm begins to gather. Every villager felt it. Each morning the air tasted sharper. The frost lingered longer upon the grass, and the smoke from hearth fires hung lower in the sky, unwilling to rise. The harvest had been good. Granaries brimmed with grain, and clay jars filled with dried peas and beans lined the huts. Apples were pressed into juice, stored cool in the earth, while honey hardened in combs wrapped with wax. Yet plenty could not soften the unease. Plenty, after all, was what drew the raiders. The village lived with the knowledge that full stores were not only security, but bait. Radomir stood often at the river's bend, gazing into the water as if it might reveal the shape of things yet to come. His rope still lay hidden beneath, anchored by baskets of stone, its barbs eager for a hole to scrape against. Ilya joined him daily, no longer the boy who once ran breathless with warnings, but a youth whose eyes had learned to watch with the patience of the water itself. Together, they adjusted the snares, shifted reeds to conceal what must remain unseen, and walked the banks to check where the mud showed signs of intrusion. Mislav in the forge no longer made plowshares. His hammer rang against iron with a steady rhythm, shaping spearheads and narrow blades meant to be hidden beneath tunics. He crafted small bucklers of wood bound with iron rims, light enough for quick hands to lift. Though his work was grim, he moved with quiet purpose, his breath a song that mingled with the bellows. He knew that the raiders, broken though they had been, would not give up. Their hunger was not of bellies alone, but of pride, and pride is the most dangerous hunger of all. Dobroslav spoke less now. His strength waned with the shortening days, but his presence still steadied the people. At night, when the younger ones gathered for tales, he told them of winters past, of ancestors who had endured harsher frosts and darker nights. "The river remembers them," he whispered, "and so it will remember you. Each trap you set, each song you sing, each child you raise, it all sinks into the current. You may think the water forgets, but it carries every memory with it, all the way to the sea." Have you ever wondered whether water itself can remember? The villagers believed it could, and in that belief lay their endurance. Signs of the raiders came again as the first ice formed along the banks. Smoke rose faintly on the horizon, too straight, too thin to be from forest fire. A fisherman found footprints in the frost near the meadow, larger than a villager's, the prints of boots hardened by journeys over rock and snow. The bells Mislav had strung along the watchpost trembled one night, though no wind stirred. The dogs whined and would not settle. All these were whispers, warnings carried like rumors through the air. The villagers prepared with a quiet efficiency born of repetition. Fires were banked low, stores hidden, children kept close. Spears were sharpened, ropes coiled, arrows bundled. Women laid charms above doors, weaving herbs and bone into knots of protection. Mirena mixed new salves, her hands steady even as her heart trembled, knowing wounds would soon need tending. The night the raiders came was moonless, wrapped in mist that clung low to the river. Their ships emerged as shadows, their oars dipping silently, their sails furled to avoid detection. They had learned much. They no longer approached with songs or torches. They came as the villagers themselves did, in silence, with patience. But the river had been taught as well. The first ship entered the bend cautiously. Its prow avoided the old traps, steering wide where past ships had struck. The men aboard smirked, believing themselves clever, believing they had outwitted the water. They did not see the new snares farther ahead, the fresh ropes that shifted with the current, the baskets weighted differently to pull in new directions. The prow struck, jolting sideways. The crew shouted, trying to adjust, but the water seized the hull like a hand, pulling it into another hidden line. Chaos spread. Arrows hissed from the reeds, silent and swift. Stones from slings cracked against shields, spears thrust from shadows. The raiders shouted, their voices swallowed by mist. Another ship tried to turn, but found itself tangled in gut strings that sang low through the wood, unsettling the men aboard. A third struck stakes, water rushing in. Panic spread. On the shore, the raiders who had crept through the forest fared no better. Their boots found the false trails Radomir and Ilya had prepared. Pits yawned open. Thorns pierced flesh. Ropes tripped legs. The villagers rose from the undergrowth, their spears steady, their faces calm. They did not shout, did not roar. They moved with the silence of the forest, striking only when certain. Fear spread faster than wounds. By dawn, the raiders were broken again. Survivors fled in shattered ships, their cries echoing as the river carried them away. The village emerged slowly, their faces pale in the gray light. They had endured once more, yet each victory felt heavier than the last. Dobroslav did not rise that morning. His breath was shallow, his eyes closed. When the people gathered, he opened them one last time, gazing at the river. "You will endure," he whispered, "because the river endures. Remember me not with sorrow, but with patience." His staff slipped from his hand, and his chest stilled. The village wept softly, not with wails, but with tears that fell silently onto the earth. They buried him on the rise above the bend, where he had so often stood watching the water. A carved staff was placed at his grave, etched with spirals and runes, a marker not only of his life, but of the memory he had woven into theirs. That night, the river flowed as always, carrying with it the elder's last breath, mingling it with the endless current. The people sat in silence, each hearing in the water's voice the echo of his counsel. The river endured. So would they. The first snows fell lightly, like a veil drawn over the land. Each flake melted on the river's skin, vanishing into its dark body, while on the fields the white began to linger, softening the sharp edges of stubble left from the harvest. Winter had returned, and with it came a deeper quiet. The river, so loud in summer with foam and oars, now spoke more slowly, each ripple muffled by the crust of ice forming along its edges. The village moved inward. Doors were closed, smoke rose thick from hearths, and the rhythm of life shifted. Where once the people had stood in the fields, now they sat by fires. Women spun flax into thread, their fingers pale but steady, while men shaped wood into handles for tools or scraped hides for clothing. Children played at the edges of the firelight, carving little figures from bone and staging battles across the packed earth floor. Their laughter bright but fragile, as if even they felt the weight pressing against the walls. Dobroslav's absence was heavy. His staff stood by the door of his hut, now empty, and his grave overlooked the bend where the river curved like a sleeping serpent. The people visited often, placing offerings of bread, herbs, or carved charms. They whispered to him, not expecting an answer, but believing that his spirit listened, mingling with the water's eternal memory. His words, "The river endures, and so must we," echoed in their minds. Marina carried the burden of his passing most keenly. She was healer, herb wife, and now, without Dobroslav, the voice that others turned to for guidance in matters not only of flesh, but of spirit. At night, she sat by her hearth, her hands busy grinding herbs, her lips moving in prayer. She felt the weight of years stretching before her, years in which she must weave wisdom into the younger ones before her own time ended. Yet she carried it without complaint, for she knew that such is the rhythm of life. The staff always passes to another hand. Radomir walked the river daily, even in frost. His boots cracked the ice at the shore, his breath misted in the cold. He checked the ropes, shifting them when necessary, his hands raw but sure. Ilya followed close, taller now, his shoulders broader, though his eyes still carried the brightness of youth. Together, they inspected each hidden snare, each reed screen, each pit dug before the freeze. They worked not with the energy of boys, but with the discipline of men who knew that survival rested on preparation. Have you ever noticed how, in winter, sound travels differently? A single crack of ice carries far, echoing across the forest like thunder. The villagers learned to move carefully, each step measured, each whisper hushed. The raiders could come even in snow. Hunger does not rest with the seasons. And so the people sharpened their patience, waiting in the silence that is sharper than any blade. The first weeks of winter passed with little sign. The snow deepened, roofs sagged under its weight, and the people bent their backs to the labor of survival. Women mended clothes, patching fur upon fur, while men split logs for fires. The ring of axe on wood sharp in the cold air. The children, restless, were given tasks to carry, water or grind grain, small duties to tether their energy. Life continued, heavy but steady. Then one morning, faint tracks appeared near the meadow, boot prints, broad and deep, not of villagers. A watchman on the platform had seen shadows moving at dawn, shapes slipping between trees, too distant to identify. The bells trembled once, faintly, as if stirred by more than wind. The warning spread quickly. The raiders had returned, not with ships, but on foot. They came through the forest, moving quietly, their axes strapped to their backs, their cloaks dusted with frost. They sought to avoid the river's teeth, to creep past where water waited, to strike from the land where traps were fewer. But the villagers had prepared. False trails wound through the forest, inviting boots to step where earth would give way. Nets woven of rope hung between trees, ready to be loosed upon shadows. Pits dug before the freeze lay hidden beneath thin layers of snow, and hunters, crouched low, watched with steady eyes. The first raiders stumbled into a pit, their cries muffled by snow. Arrows loosed from branches struck swiftly, silent as falling flakes. Others pressed forward, only to find themselves tangled in nets, dragged to the ground where spears awaited. The forest itself became a trap, its silence broken only by sudden shouts and the brief clash of steel. Radomir and Ilya moved among the trees like shadows. Their slings snapped stones into helms, their spears struck quickly and withdrew. They did not linger to fight openly. They struck and vanished, leaving fear behind. The raiders grew restless, shouting, slashing at empty air. Panic spread faster than wounds. By nightfall, those who survived had fled, stumbling back through the forest, leaving behind their dead and their pride. The snow covered their tracks swiftly, as if the earth itself wished to forget them. The village gathered in silence once more. They had won, yet the weight of survival pressed upon them heavier than any wound. Dobroslav's words lingered. Teaching is slower than killing, and they knew it was true. The raiders had learned again, but so had they. The struggle was not finished. It was only paused. That night, Mirena walked alone to Dobroslav's grave. She placed a sprig of juniper upon the mound and whispered, "We have endured, but your patience must be ours now." The wind stirred the snow, carrying her words across the bend. The river, silent beneath its frozen skin, seemed to listen. Have you ever stood in a winter night so still that even your own breath sounded like a drum? The villagers did, and in that stillness they found strength. For silence, too, can be a weapon. The river endured, and with it, so did they. The night did not arrive suddenly upon the highlands. It bled slowly across the sky, as though the day itself was reluctant to depart. The sun lingered like a weary traveler, dragging his cloak of amber light across the moors, while the mist that clung to the valleys thickened and rose to meet the coming dark. Somewhere, beyond the folds of heather and pine, the sea murmured against hidden cliffs, and the wind carried scents of peat smoke and wet stone. It was into this slow descent of day that the story of the Picts and Vikings deepened, carved like grooves into the enduring granite of the land. For the Picts, twilight was not only a time of shadows, it was a time of vision. Within the settlements clustered around the hills, women gathered herbs that could only be cut beneath the half-light, roots that were said to lose their strength if torn from the earth beneath the full blaze of day. Men returned from hunting, their bodies damp with the sweat of labor and the mist of the bogs. Fires were lit in hollows shielded from wandering eyes, their flames small and steady, so that no marauder drifting across the moors might see them. To be unseen was their strength. To vanish into the folds of the land was their heritage. Children whispered stories of the mist spirits, of shadowed riders who traveled not upon horses, but upon clouds, their faces painted with woad and their eyes glimmering like the cold stars. The elders did not dismiss these tales, for they knew that stories were as much weapons as spears. In the dark, fear took shape more readily than flesh, and a Viking alone on the moor might be undone, not by a blade, but by the conviction that ghosts moved in the fog beside him. Yet as night deepened, there were no ghosts, only men, sharpened by loss, by memory, by the will to endure. The Picts were planning still, far to the north, in a longhouse that smelled of sea brine and animal hides. The Vikings huddled together. Their chieftain's voice broke through the smoke that curled from the fire pit, steady and severe. His braids were crusted with salt, his cloak torn at the shoulder where an arrow had grazed him in the last ambush. His eyes narrowed beneath a brow heavy with both fury and calculation. "They vanish," he said, his voice low, but heavy as a stone dropped in still water. "Always they vanish. Not one body left for our ravens, not one skull to mark the ground." Around him, the warriors muttered, some in anger, some in unease. For a Viking, to die without leaving a mark was a fate worse than death itself. To fight a foe who slipped like water through the fingers was to battle the air, to strike shadows that returned in silence. They hungered for blood, for plunder, for a fight that would swell their names into sagas. Instead, they were caught in an endless chase through mists and thickets, mocked by the land itself. One warrior leaned forward, his knuckles white on the haft of his axe. "These hill ghosts do not stand. They run. They scatter. Let us burn them out. Set fire to every hill where they hide. Smoke will drive them into our blades." But the chieftain shook his head. He knew the land better now. Fire spread in ways no man could predict. The winds that twisted through the glens might carry flame back into the trees where his own men slept. To strike with blind force was to invite ruin. He was no fool, though rage seethed beneath his ribs. "They know the rivers," he muttered at last. "They know the bogs. We drown where they walk. Their arrows find us before our axes find them. If they will not face us in open field, then we must break their paths, sever the veins of this land, fill the rivers with stone, fell the trees that give them cover, strip them of their hiding places, and they will wither." But even as he spoke, doubt lingered. Could one strip a ghost of its fog? Could one unweave a mist? On the moors above, the Picts gathered at a standing stone carved with spirals that wound inward upon themselves like mazes of the soul. Here the Druids spoke, voices low, their chants threaded with a rhythm of breath and earth. They saw more than battle in the fog. They saw continuance, the old ways battling against a tide that sought to drown them. A woman named Merin knelt before the stone, her hands painted in spirals of blue, her hair woven with heather stems. She was no warrior in the sense of spear and shield, yet her presence steadied the others. She had dreamed of the sea darkening, of ships like teeth biting into the horizon, and she had warned of these raiders before the first sail was sighted. Now she stood among the men, her voice carrying with a certainty that lent strength to trembling hearts. "They will break themselves," she said, her eyes reflecting firelight. "The land does not yield to strangers. The bog swallows, the mist blinds, the stone remembers. We need only endure. They will vanish into the night as their kin have before." The men listened, their fists clenching around the shafts of their spears. For to hear such words was to be reminded that survival itself was a victory. It was not long after midnight when the fog thickened to the point where even torches became nothing but muted stars. Along the edge of a river, swollen with autumn rains, the Picts laid their trap. Stones had been shifted in silence during the day, narrowing the river's course until its waters swirled in treacherous eddies. Stakes were driven into the mud, their tips hardened by fire, and in the reeds, men crouched, their faces painted so that even the pale moonlight revealed nothing but streaks of blue shadow. The Vikings came as expected, first as shadows themselves, their shields half hidden by mist, their boots dragging in the muck. They followed the riverbank, seeking what they believed to be a ford. Their voices muttered in Norse, guttural and sharp against the stillness. One carried a torch, but the light seemed to die with each step, smothered by the mist. A spear hissed from the reeds. The torch-bearer fell, the flame extinguished in the wet mud. Shouts erupted. Another spear struck, and a man stumbled into the river, swallowed at once by the churning current. The Vikings surged forward, axes raised, but the reeds seemed to birth foes from the very earth. Figures darted, vanished, reappeared, striking and withdrawing in silence. Arrows arced unseen, their impact the only sign of their flight. The river swallowed screams. The reeds hid corpses. And by the time the Vikings pulled back, dragging their wounded into the mist, the ford was littered with emptiness. No bodies remained, for the Picts carried their dead into the folds of the land, leaving no proof for sagas, no trophies for their foes. Morning came gray, the sun little more than a pale smear on the horizon. The Vikings huddled, exhausted, their numbers thinned. Some spoke of returning to the sea, of finding villages more yielding, less haunted by phantoms. Others snarled at the thought, unwilling to yield ground to those they saw as wild and faceless. But in their silence, they all felt it, the creeping realization that they were not fighting men alone. They were fighting a land that refused them, a mist that swallowed them, a silence that mocked their roars. The Picts, hidden still in their hills, did not cheer nor gloat. They sharpened their spears, mended their cloaks, and whispered to their children that the mist had claimed more prey. And as the wind rose across the heather, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, the land itself seemed to sigh in quiet triumph. For battles were not always won with thunder and fire. Sometimes they were won with patience, with silence, with the endurance to become the shadow that never dies. The highlands slept once more, but its sleep was not empty. It carried echoes of spears loosed in silence, of screams swallowed by rivers, of warriors who found themselves ghosts in a land that belonged to others. And in those echoes, the story of the Picts grew stronger, woven deeper into the fog that never lifted, into the stones that never moved, into the heather that bloomed year after year, untouched, unbroken. The sun rose pale and thin across the highland ridges, as if reluctant to shed its light upon ground already soaked with stories of ambush, silence, and loss. A frost had gathered in the night, crisping the heather so that each stem glittered when the breeze shifted. From a distance, the land might have seemed peaceful, a tapestry woven in mist, shadow, and glimmer. Yet beneath that veil, tension still coiled like a waiting serpent. The Vikings, battered from weeks of skirmishes and the endless damp of the north, trudged with heavy steps across moorland that felt infinite. Their boots, cracked from wet and salt, made dull crunches over frozen turf. The sound seemed too loud in a land where even the crows hushed, as though all living things deferred to the unseen watchers, the Picts. The warriors had learned painfully that silence here was never emptiness. The mist concealed, the heather whispered, and the stones themselves seemed to listen. The men muttered in low tones, glancing often toward the dark ridges, knowing that eyes were likely upon them, eyes painted with blue woad and sharpened with ancestral fire. At the head of the weary column, Jarl Eirik raised a hand, halting the march. His gray-flecked braids hung heavy with dew, and his axe, though still sharp, seemed weighed by more than iron. He looked not at his men, but at the horizon, where a raven circled slowly above a ridge of standing stones. Its flight traced a pattern both ominous and steady, a loop as if marking territory. One of his men whispered, "The raven watches for us, Jarl." A sign Eric did not answer at once. The raven turned, dipped its wings, and vanished into the fog toward the stones. His heart, though iron-bound, tightened. In Norse lands, ravens meant Odin's messengers, watchers of fates. But here, in the highlands, where Pictish stones bore beasts and spirals unknown to northern runes, who could say to whom the raven truly spoke? He lifted his voice, low and slow, as if calming his men, but also steadying his own resolve. We walk a land that swallows sound, yet carries memory. Hold close, shields high, no one strays. The men obeyed, forming tighter ranks. Shields that once gleamed, now dulled with scratches and moss stains, rose in overlapping arcs. The column shrank into a moving wall, trudging steadily toward the ridge. As they neared the stones, the fog thickened until it clung like wool to their faces. The stones themselves emerged gradually, monoliths rising taller than men, carved with swirling beasts, fish, and crescents. The carvings seemed to writhe under the pale light, shapes shifting as mist slid across their surfaces. Here, the men slowed. The air felt colder, as though the stones leached warmth. One warrior crossed himself, muttering Christian prayers under his breath, though most of the band still clung to the old gods. Another spat, whispering, "This place stinks of magic." And then, faint at first, came a sound. Not the clash of weapons, nor the whistle of arrows, but a rhythm, a low drumbeat, steady, heartbeat slow. It pulsed through the fog, resonating in the stones until the Vikings felt it in their chests. The raven cried once, sharp, from somewhere unseen. Eirik's knuckles whitened on his axe. "Form circle," he barked. Instinct moved the men, shields locked, backs pressed together, eyes darting through the veil. The drumbeat grew louder, layered with another sound. Voices, chanting in guttural tones. Not Norse, not Latin. The cadence was alien, rising and falling with the drum, as if calling something from the stones themselves. Mist shifted, and shadows appeared. Picks, painted in spirals of woad, slid between stone and heather like phantoms. They carried long spears, bows strung with sinew, and in their eyes burned a calm fire. Neither frenzy nor fear, but certainty. One Viking loosed a nervous roar, rushing forward with axe raised. He barely crossed 3 strides before an arrow hissed, burying in his throat. He collapsed without a cry, blood steaming against the frost. The chant did not falter. The circle held. Arrows struck shields, spears probed the gaps, but the Vikings braced and shoved outward, snarling. Eirik raised his axe high and bellowed, the sound splitting mist. His men surged, breaking the circle into a wedge that drove toward the nearest gap in the line. For a moment, steel met spear, and cries burst through the fog. The Picts yielded ground, vanishing between stones, only to reappear at the flanks. They struck and vanished, struck and vanished, a rhythm echoing the drums. It was not war, as the Northmen knew. It was a weaving, a pattern of appearing and fading, a dance with shadows. The Vikings' strength, their brutal directness, found no solid foe to crush. Every step forward left another man fallen, pierced by unseen arrows or dragged into mist with strangled cries. Eirik fought with grim patience, each swing deliberate, not wasted. His breath steamed in harsh bursts. His arms ached, yet his mind sharpened. He began to see the pattern, the way the picks struck not at random, but in rhythm with the drum. He marked the pauses, the intervals of silence. "Hold when they vanish," he growled to his men. "Move only when the chant falls quiet. Watch the raven." And strangely, it worked. They began to anticipate, shifting their shields at the right heartbeat, striking when the chant lulled. For every Viking felled, a Pict fell as well, dragged down in a roar of axes and boots. The fog swirled with screams and shadows. Blood darkened the frost, soaking into earth that seemed to drink deeply. At last, a horn sounded, a deep, echoing call from the ridge. The Picts stilled as one, their chant ceasing mid-syllable, Mist rolled heavier, swallowing forms until only the stones remained. The raven cried once more and flew off into pale dawn. Silence descended, vast and heavy. The Vikings stood panting, shields dented, armor streaked with blood. Around them lay their dead, too many. Of the band that had entered the ridge, nearly half remained. Eirik lowered his axe, chest heaving. He looked at the stones, where the carvings seemed to shimmer in dawn light, and felt no triumph. Only the weight of land that rejected them, that fed itself with their struggle. He spoke softly, though all could hear. This is not war as we know. This is something older. The land itself fights us, through them. His men, pale and hollow-eyed, nodded mutely. They understood. This was no mere clash of tribes, but a deeper defiance, carved into stone and sung through mist. As they gathered their wounded and prepared to retreat from the ridge, the drumbeat pulsed once more. Distant, faint, like a heart deep beneath the hills. And the raven, black against the whitening sky, circled once before flying west. The men followed its flight with weary eyes, uncertain whether it was omen or warning. In their silence, in the crunch of boots over frost, lay the knowledge that they were not conquerors here, but intruders in a land that remembered. The valley lay hushed beneath the grip of autumn, a stillness woven from chill breezes and the hushed tones of a people who had learned long ago to live with shadows. The Picts, with their watchful eyes and blue-painted skin, held the ridgelines in silence, their hunters moving as specters through the thinning trees. To the Vikings, who had pressed deeper inland with boldness fueled by steel and pride, the air itself felt heavy, as though the mountains had chosen to lean in closer, watching, judging. The long columns of Norse warriors carried with them more than weapons and shields. They carried a hunger, the need to reclaim what they had lost in earlier clashes, where men had vanished into the fog and returned no more. They told themselves that this time would be different. This time, they had mapped the rivers, marked the valleys, and watched the skies. Yet every forward step pressed them deeper into a land that whispered of treachery, where trails bent into spirals and paths seemed to unravel beneath their boots. The Scots to the south and the Gaels who clung to their craggy fortresses had begun to whisper of new alliances. The Norse, they said, could bleed, they could falter, and the Picts, guardians of the mist, had shown the first proof of that truth. But the heart of this struggle was not only blood and land, it was memory. For every Pictish mother who pressed a hand to her child's hair and whispered blessings against the long ships, there was a Viking wife staring at an empty shore, waiting for a man who had gone west and might not return. The clash of these worlds was woven into the breath of the people, deeper than spears, older than shields. The season turned cruel. Rains lashed the valleys, swollen rivers tearing at their banks, and mists clinging longer to the heather. The Picts thrived in such weather, moving barefoot across slick stone, their tattoos dark against pale skin, vanishing when branches swayed. The Vikings cursed and tightened their cloaks, the weight of wet mail dragging their bodies down. Yet still they marched, because retreat was dishonor, and dishonor weighed heavier than hunger. At night, fires were lit in hollows of stone, flames hidden so they would not betray their glow. Around them, men whispered of omens, a raven that had followed for days, always perched on the highest trees, its eyes reflecting firelight like molten iron. Some claimed it was Odin's messenger guiding them. Others muttered that it was a spirit of this land, watching, promising doom. The Picts, in their own camps high among the ridges, sang low songs that blended with the wind. They sang of ancestors who had bled upon the same stones, of battles where the earth itself had risen to shield them. Their chants carried through the fog, faint mournful yet steady, a reminder to every warrior that they fought not alone, but with the bones of their fathers beneath their feet. One night, as rain hammered the earth and streams turned into torrents, the Norse war leader, Eirik, called his men close. His hair clung to his face, braids thick with mud, eyes steel bright in the fire's flicker. We have followed rivers, climbed hills, and tasted only mist. But tomorrow we turn their own traps against them. The Picts think us blind to stone and shadow. Let us show them we, too, can hunt. His words found weary ears, but also stoked something primal. The refusal to be prey. Morning broke gray, the sky a low ceiling pressing upon the hills. The Vikings advanced not in one line, but in broken groups, shields lifted, eyes sharp. And when the Picts struck, arrows loosed from ridges, stones rolled from high places. The Norsemen surged not in panic, but with waiting fury. They cut paths through bracken, pursued shadows into gullies, and for the first time, drew blood that did not vanish back into mist. Yet victory was an illusion, fragile and quick to shatter. For every Pict felled, another appeared, silent as breath, spear flashing, disappearing again. The land was their ally. Mud clung to Viking boots, while the Picts skimmed the surface. Stones slicked with moss betrayed heavy footfalls, while light steps passed unharmed. The battle became less of men against men, and more of one people against the very bones of another's homeland. By dusk, the valley had drunk deeply. Streams ran darker, and bodies lay half submerged in water that whispered onward. The Norse dragged their dead together, laying them beneath shields, speaking the names of ancestors as the smoke of pyres curled into the rain. The Picts, too, carried their wounded into the high caves, where women pressed herbs into gashes and painted fresh spirals of woad to guard the spirit as well as the flesh. Neither side could claim triumph. Both claimed endurance, and so the war turned into something more than raids and ambushes. It became a test of wills, of which people could outlast the other in the grip of mountains and mist. The Picts had patience, decades of memory in their bones, an understanding that time itself was their ally. The Vikings had fire, the fury to burn, to strike, to leave behind scars that might outlast their presence. As weeks dragged into months, whispers of the struggle carried far beyond the glens. Southward, among Saxon courts, men listened closely. Could it be that the Norse were meeting their match in the highlands? Westward, among the Gaels, old rivalries softened, for they saw in the Picts a mirror of their own battles, fighting not just for survival, but for identity. In the highlands, an elder of the Picts, her hair silver, eyes dark as peat water, spoke to her kin. They will not leave, not soon, but neither will we. Remember this, our strength is not only in spear and bow, but in the patience of the mist. Let them rage. We endure. Her words spread through the ridges, like the call of an owl at night, quiet, steady, but heard by all. Meanwhile, in the Norse camp, Eirik walked among his men, touching shoulders, speaking low. He reminded them of homelands waiting, of children who must be fed, of gods who watched to see if their courage held. He did not speak of easy victory, for none could believe that now. Instead, he spoke of endurance too, the same thread, but woven with fire instead of mist. And so, the stage of history tightened. Two peoples, bound by pride, shadow, hunger, and memory, pressed against one another in the narrow glens of Scotland. Neither would bend, neither would yield. But the land itself remembered. The stones held stories of blood both new and ancient. The rivers carried whispers of oaths broken and kept. And the wind, oh, the wind, sang of a time when only mountains had stood here, and men were nothing but fleeting shadows passing through. The battle between Picts and Vikings was more than history. It was the meeting of storm and stone, and storms, for all their fury, always pass. But stone waits. The spring thaw gave way to summer's slow green, and the high glens of the Pictish country breathed once more. Grass unfurled where snow had buried earth for months, and the dripping of meltwater ran in silver rivulets down stone. Yet though the land softened, the hearts of men remained flint. The Vikings, licking wounds from failed marches through the mist, spoke of returning with heavier axes, more ships, more fire. And the Picts, sharpened by memory, turned to their ancestral ways of preparing, not in open muster upon fields, but in the hidden crafting of illusions, the weaving of fear, the patient layering of ambushes like moss upon stone. In villages scattered across the highlands, the elders called young ones to gatherings around long, low fires. Women painted faces with woad, not only for battle, but for ritual remembrance. Children learned the sound of silent running through heather, the touch of stone upon foot, the scent of fog before it swallowed sight. What to the outsider seemed like little more than peasant training was, in truth, the passing of a silent scripture. It was the creed of survival, older than Viking longships, older than Rome itself. Among those who listened was Mael, son of a shepherd, slain years ago in a border raid. He had grown taller, the wiry strength of his youth hardened by seasons of chase and hunger. His mother whispered to him as he sharpened a spear, "The mist remembers. Do not think you fight alone. Every drop of rain, every bird that circles above, every stone shaped by wind, they fight with us if we know how to listen." These were not empty words. To the Picts, the land was not backdrop but kin. Each valley kept a secret passage, each cliff an echoing answer. And so summer became a season not of idle rest, but of invisible work. Scouts traced every inlet along the coast where Viking ships might land. Hunters laid false trails through pine forests, dragging branches to confuse tracking eyes. Nets of woven bramble were prepared to be drawn across narrow passes, as effective at halting horsemen as iron barricades. Even the rivers were given their part to play. Stones loosened just so, banks cut to invite sudden floods when dammed water was released. The land itself would ambush the invader. When word came that longships had once more cut the horizon, dark sails pressing toward coves beneath cliffs, the Pictish watchfires flared. Yet no panic surged. Villages did not gather in disarray. There was no headlong rush to meet the foe. Instead, silence spread, deliberate and heavy. Livestock were herded deeper into glens, huts abandoned to stand as bait. The Vikings came ashore to emptiness, an unsettling emptiness that gnawed at their bravado. They marched inland expecting the clash of armies, but found only the hiss of mist and the occasional arrow loosed from nowhere. When they set torches to a thatched roof, another village vanished before they arrived. Each step forward sank them deeper into a labyrinth of absence. This was not war as they understood it. It was a dissolving of certainty. Mael and others lay in wait near a narrow ravine where the path wound between dripping stone. They had rigged logs overhead, bound by ropes of twisted hide. The Vikings entered laughing, certain that only shadows threatened them. When the first log thundered down, crushing two men and blocking retreat, laughter turned to shouts. Spears thrust from above, stones rained, and in the chaos wolves, half tamed by hunger and accustomed to human signal, were loosed into the ravine. The screams carried far, but the mist swallowed them quickly, and silence returned. This ambush, whispered about afterward, was not remembered merely for blood, but for what it taught. That fear magnified itself in confinement. A single Pictish youth, darting unseen, could unman 3 Vikings, for their minds conjured hosts where only one stood. Mael, clutching his bloodied spear, did not exult. He only breathed heavily and whispered, as his mother had taught, "The mist remembers." Through that summer, More such ambushes unfolded. One night, torches appeared along a ridge, scores of them, suggesting a great host. The Vikings rallied in alarm, only to discover the flames were tied to cattle driven by hidden hands. In their confusion, real arrows fell, thinning their ranks. Another time, they heard horns echoing through the valley. Dozens, then hundreds of blasts, though in truth, only 6 Pictish warriors circled, sounding in different places. The Vikings, weary from sleepless dread, retreated back toward their ships long before the Picts ever closed in force. Yet the Picts knew better than to rejoice too soon. For each Viking band driven away, another loomed beyond the sea. Some chieftains of the north whispered that the invaders would never cease, that steel and fire would multiply until even mist could not smother them. Others counseled that endurance, not conquest, was the path of survival. Bend like the pine, never break. As autumn neared, Mile found himself standing among elders at a stone circle, their faces lit by harvest fire. They debated not whether to fight, for fight they must, but how to remember who they were beyond fighting. One elder woman, hair white as frost, lifted her voice. "We are not only guardians of soil, we are keepers of memory. If we lose our ways, if our children learn only fear, then even victory will taste of ash." So songs were sung, not merely of raids repelled, but of rivers flowing, of deer returning to valleys, of children born beneath stars. In this, the Picts wove a shield stronger than iron, the certainty that their life was more than defiance, it was belonging. Winter approached again. Fog thickened, days shortened, and the Vikings whispered that the highlands were cursed. They carried away tales of ghostly warriors who struck unseen, of valleys where voices echoed without source, of rivers that rose to devour ships. And though many Picts had fallen, though grief weighed heavy on widows and orphans, the land itself seemed to cradle them, whispering that endurance was victory enough. The story of Mael and his kin had not ended. It pressed onward, through frost and fire, through silence and song. The Picts remained. Their shadows lengthened across stone, their woad-stained faces lit in memory, their whispers braided with mist. And somewhere on a high ridge, wolves howled, not in hunger alone, but in chorus with a people who had made the land itself their ally. Night was not only the hour of shadows and campfires, but the season of memory itself. As the Slavic villages along the riverways slid deeper into their cycle of endurance, each dusk became a soft net that caught voices, fears, and hope. With the wolves pacing beyond the ring of light, with the mist curling where reeds bent low, families gathered close and spoke in whispers that trembled like the water's own reflection. Children, who had seen blood too soon, leaned against their mothers and tried to forget the cries they had overheard in the marsh. Men rubbed the hafts of their spears, as though touching wood could promise that wood would hold against steel. Elders closed their eyes and let the smoke of the fire sting them into remembering older battles survived. The Pictish ambushes and the Viking raids were not known here, yet the pattern of sudden violence was the same. A still night, then the thunder of oars, the glint of iron, and the silence afterward, when only the wounded groaned. The Slavic tribes had lived too long in forests to believe peace could last. They knew the river was both friend and betrayer. It fed them, let them trade furs and honey, carried their boats with quiet strength. Yet it also brought strangers, their sails swollen with hunger for conquest. At the heart of the encampments, long, low huts of woven branches and clay held their warmth. The smell of rye bread lingered, baked on hot stones buried in the coals. Clay pots of cabbage, barley, and river fish simmered, promising endurance more than pleasure. The simple meals gave strength, and the ritual of sharing them reminded everyone of why they endured. To leave a bowl empty for the spirits of the drowned was as much a duty as sharpening spears. Memory itself was nourishment. In these nights of half-rest, warriors traced the old symbols on their shields: spirals for water, sharp runes for resistance, circles broken by lines for traps laid across the flow of the river. To carve was to focus the mind. The slow scraping of knife on wood was like the slow heartbeat of the camp. Children watched, and though their eyes were heavy, they remembered. Someday, when they were no longer children, they too would shape spirals and broken circles. One elder, bearded like moss growing thick on stone, spoke quietly into the fire. The river is never ours. It is never theirs. It is its own. The others nodded, because they too had seen men drown without a blow struck, boats splinter against hidden snags, hunters vanish beneath thin ice. The river was a god that took and gave without explanation. To use it for war was to touch a spirit far older than steel. That was why they placed their traps with offerings of bread and herbs, why they whispered charms as they stretched cords beneath the surface, not to appease the enemy, but to ask the water itself to choose its justice. Far off, a dog barked. The sound rolled through the stillness. Heads turned, but no alarm was raised. They knew the dog was only warning of foxes, or perhaps spirits walking close to the edge of the fire's reach. Still, every ear stayed open. Fear was not cowardice here. Fear was memory's guardian, keeping the body alive when the mind dreamed too deeply. By dawn, when the mist thinned, scouts would move again along the reed beds. They would test the tautness of the cords, reset spears angled in the mud, and count the footprints on the far bank. The tribes did not wait idly. They adjusted every night, for they knew the raiders too adjusted. One night, a trap might succeed. The next, it might betray. Vigilance was the only shield stronger than wood. And so the night stretched, stitched together with whispers, the slow carving of runes, the taste of ash and bread, the quiet promise that though the river was never theirs, they would still meet every dawn upon its banks. Dawn came slowly, as though the sky itself were reluctant to step into another day of watchfulness. A thin fog clung to the river, and the surface shivered when a fish rose to break it. The light was silver, not yet gold, and the huts of the village seemed carved from the mist rather than built from reed, clay, and timber. The people stirred quietly, for mornings were never filled with cheer. They rose with a kind of solemn acceptance, like trees bending to the season's weight. The men went to the water first. They checked the woven baskets lowered into the current during the night, traps baited for fish, but also serving as quiet signals of intrusion. If a basket was broken or missing, it told of more than fish. Scouts crouched low among the reeds, running calloused fingers over damp footprints. They measured the width, the weight, the direction. A footprint was a story, a line of truth pressed into mud. When it belonged to kin, it reassured. When it belonged to strangers, it warned. This morning, a young scout named Radomir found the prints of a heavy boot on the far bank. The edges were sharp, fresh, not yet blurred by rain. He ran his palm over it, feeling the weight of an armored man who had stepped there. Beside the print was the faint drag of a spear butt, and further off, the mark of a boat pushed against the bank. Radomir's heart tightened. He knew it was not one of theirs. No Slavic warrior wore iron-bound boots. These were the steps of men who came from beyond the sea. He returned silently to the village, his breath controlled, though his chest burned. In the central clearing, where the fire still smoked, he crouched before the elders. "They have landed," he said. His voice was not loud, but every ear caught it. Silence spread across the people like frost spreading across still water. Mothers held their children tighter. Men set aside their bread and rose. Elders lowered their gaze to the earth, as if listening for the river's answer. Old Zorislav, the bearded elder who had spoken of the river the night before, nodded gravely. "The nets are ready," he said. "The spears are planted. But we must be smoke, not fire. Let them chase ghosts until their feet are weary." And so the people prepared. They did not ring the air with horns or clang iron on iron. They moved softly, as hunters do. Some slipped into the forest, bows strung, arrows tucked into birch bark quivers. Others took to the marshy islands, where reeds grew taller than men, and where their traps lay hidden just beneath the water's face. Women pulled the younger children into the huts, whispering songs to keep their small bodies calm, while older boys were given stones and slings. Every hand, no matter how small, had its duty. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the sound. Distant at first, then closer. Oars striking water. Voices rough, speaking a tongue that rolled like thunder. The villagers did not look directly. They knew better than to show their eyes to the enemy too soon. They let the mist and reeds do the watching. The first longboat slid into view, its carved prow cutting the fog like a blade. Iron helmets caught the light. Shields rimmed with metal glinted as they lined the boat's edge. These were not shadows or rumors now. They were men, broad-shouldered, pale-faced, with hair plaited and eyes searching. The raiders leaned forward, their mouths curled with the hunger of conquest. But the river did not yield easily. The first oar caught on a submerged branch, snapping the rhythm. The boat rocked. A voice shouted, angry. Another longboat followed close, too close, and the two nearly collided. From the bank, Radomir's breath steadied. The traps had begun to whisper. A spear planted beneath the water snagged the hull, tearing it with a sound more felt than heard. Water trickled in. The men cursed and shifted. A second spear, angled with patient hands the night before, caught another boat, driving it slightly askew. The raiders fought the current with furious strokes, but each correction drew them deeper into the marsh, where reeds tangled and cords waited. Hidden in the reeds, Slavic warriors tightened ropes that had been looped to branches. As they pulled, woven nets lifted beneath the surface, ensnaring oars and dragging them sideways. Raiders tried to slash the cords, but the river laughed with its own strength. The boat slowed. Men stumbled, and that was when the first arrows fell. They came not in volleys, but in whispers, one here, one there. Each arrow loosed from the reeds was a question asked by the tribe. Will you bleed here, or will you flee? The raiders lifted shields, shouting, pointing, trying to find the unseen. But the forest gave no answers. It only gave more shadows. A raider slipped on wet planks, falling into the water. He rose sputtering, only to feel the sudden sting of a sharpened stake hidden beneath the surface. His cry was cut short. Another man lunged to pull him free, and both vanished beneath the churned water. The Slavs did not cheer. They did not roar. They watched, silent as trees, patient as wolves circling in snow. The river was on their side, but it was not finished. One of the boats managed to break free, its oars cutting hard, dragging it toward firmer bank. Warriors leapt into the shallows, splashing, roaring. Their iron shone wet. Their axes lifted. But as their feet struck the soft mud, the ground betrayed them. What had looked like solid earth was only a mat of reeds hiding a pit. Two men sank waist deep before they understood, and arrows found them as they struggled. On the far bank, more raiders hesitated. They had seen enough to know the water was haunted with traps. But hesitation was a wound of its own. To pause in fear was to let the forest's arrows keep whispering, and whisper they did, with calm precision. Each shaft that struck sent a ripple of dread through the invaders' hearts. By midday, the raiders dragged their wounded back to the boats that still floated free. The river's skin was stained, reeds swaying around broken oars. They shouted in anger, shaking weapons toward the forest, But the trees answered with only silence. No Slavic face revealed itself. No challenge was thrown, for that was not the way of this war. When the last boat turned downstream, pushed by the current they could not tame, the people of the river slipped from their hiding places. They moved like mist taking form, quiet but resolute. They retrieved what could be salvaged: iron blades from the drowned, shields cracked and floating, even the bodies of enemies to be buried with respect for the river's justice. Radomir stood at the bank, his chest rising slow and steady. He had seen the prince. He had spoken the warning, and now he had seen the river choose sides. Yet he knew this was not an ending. It was only a breath, a pause between storms. The raiders would return. They always did. And so the people would continue their weaving of traps, their carving of runes, their whispers to the water. The river was never theirs, but they belonged to it, and through them it had spoken. Mist still clung to the banks of the river when the first dull clang of steel echoed through the forest. It was not the crisp, triumphant sound of weapons ringing in open challenge, but rather the muffled and weary noise of men testing their dulled blades, sharpening, preparing, muttering beneath their breath. The Slavic warriors who had survived the long months of ambush and retreat gathered like smoke around their campfires, moving cautiously, speaking softly, as though afraid to rouse the spirits that prowled the marshes. The chieftain's shadow stretched across the damp earth. His beard was matted, his cloak ragged, and his hands bore the scars of countless encounters in the reeds. He stood beside the river, listening to its slow gurgle, feeling its currents whisper against the piled timbers of a half-finished trap. This was no longer the spring campaign of bold beginnings. It was late autumn, when the air bit into the skin and the forest floor lay slick with rot. Hunger lingered in the camp, and yet the chieftain knew the struggle was not yet finished. For though many Vikings had already fallen to the water snares, though boats had splintered and warriors vanished beneath the silt, the Norse had not turned back. They came again and again, driven by something beyond plunder. Some said it was pride. Others whispered it was desperation, for their ships had sailed far and supplies dwindled. And always the Slavic warriors were waiting, crouched in the mist, their spears angled low, their nets sunk deep, their patience stretched yet unbroken. The scouts returned at dawn, mud streaking their shins, reeds tangled in their hair. They brought word. A fresh column of Norsemen, leaner than before, their axes worn but still sharp, was pressing upriver. They moved slower now, their songs less bold, yet their eyes no less fierce. The chieftain heard this and lifted his gaze toward the tangled treetops. He felt in his chest the old mixture of dread and grim resolve. This river had already drunk more blood than any before. Could it drink again? He ordered the men to their posts, his voice steady, his eyes never blinking. The younger warriors rushed to tighten the ropes along the trap lines, to hammer the last stakes into the muddy banks. Older men settled by the fires, sharpening spears, murmuring prayers to spirits of forest and stream. Some scattered offerings, crumbs of bread, slivers of fat, into the current, watching as the water carried them away. No one laughed. Even the children of the camp, who had grown accustomed to the rhythm of ambush, played silently, tracing circles in the dirt with sticks. As dusk fell, the mist grew heavy. It did not rise in sudden veils, but settled slowly, as though woven by invisible hands. The Norse ships appeared first as shadows, then as dim lantern glows, then as hulking shapes pressing into the narrow bends. Oars dipped with caution, blades creaking, their rhythm broken and uncertain. Perhaps they had learned too much of this river's appetite. Yet still, they came. The Slavic chieftain stood upon a ridge above the bend. He watched as the first longship nosed into the narrowing current. Beneath its keel, weighted nets shifted in the black water. Farther downstream, stakes angled upward like teeth, hidden until the moment of collision. His warriors crouched low, their bows strung, their hearts thudding in unison with the river's pull. The trap was sprung with no cry, no sudden roar. It began with a lurch. The longship shuddered, its prow caught, timbers grinding against unseen spikes. Shouts rose from the Norsemen. Oars flailed, axes hacked at the ropes, but the current twisted them sideways, dragging the hull into the snare. Another ship tried to turn, but its stern snagged the weighted lines. In the space of heartbeats, confusion spread like wildfire. Arrows hissed through the fog. Some struck wood, others found flesh. Norsemen bellowed, some plunging into the river, their mail dragging them down like stones. Spears thrust from the reeds, vanishing again into shadow. The air filled with the cries of men and the gurgle of water swallowing planks. The chieftain did not smile. He did not rejoice. He merely nodded once, grim as the roots beneath his feet, for he knew what it meant to trap desperate men. They fought harder, with teeth bared, their backs pressed against the certainty of death. And indeed, even as their ships broke apart, the Norse rallied. They leapt into the shallows, axes cleaving reeds, shields raised against the arrows. Their fury cut a path through the first line of Slavic hunters. The battle was not a roar, but a grinding, suffocating struggle. Mud sucked at boots, mist blinded, breath came ragged. Men slipped, struck, fell soundlessly into the current. The chieftain waded forward at last, spear in hand, his voice carrying above the din. Hold the line, hold the river. His warriors pressed in, surrounding, circling, like wolves around a wounded stag. Hours passed, though none could say how many. The mist never lifted. The moon never showed. By the time silence returned, the river was littered with broken shields, drifting corpses, shattered masts. The survivors, Slavic and Norse alike, staggered on the banks, too weary to finish one. Another? The chieftain stood among them, chest heaving, spear tip dulled. He looked at the faces of his men, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but alive. He looked at the Norse captives, kneeling in the mud, their pride burned out, but their gaze unyielding, and he felt no triumph, only the weight of knowing that the river had claimed more sons, and tomorrow it would hunger again. When dawn came, the mists rolled back slowly, revealing the scale of what had been done. The river gleamed red in the first light. Birds circled above, their cries echoing through the trees. The chieftain closed his eyes and listened. He thought of those who would never return to their huts, of mothers waiting with bread that would go uneaten, of the endless cycle of ambush and revenge. Still, he ordered the traps rebuilt. Still, he told the men to prepare for what was yet to come. For though this night had been theirs, the story was not ended. Somewhere beyond the horizon, more sails would rise, and more men would march into the mist. And so the river whispered on, carrying both memory and warning, its voice neither kind nor cruel, only eternal. Through the gray embrace of another dawn, when the river steamed faintly in the chill, and the reeds whispered with secret voices, the Slavic tribes prepared once more to move their war. The old traps still glimmered under water, still baited with sharpened stakes and woven nets. Yet new snares had been crafted during the long, dark hours. Wooden figures, carved in silence, stood along the tree lines. Effigies of guardians with painted eyes and hollow mouths, staring into the mist as though the gods themselves had joined the watch. Fires had burned low, their smoke coiling like veins in the morning sky, and the warriors' breath plumed as if their very souls sought release into the endless air. It had been many nights since the first ambush, Many more, since the blood of the Norse had slicked the pebbles of the riverbank. But memory did not fade. It deepened, settled, hardened like iron cooled in the forge. Each face remembered in silence was a testament. Mothers still hummed their quiet laments at dusk. Children traced patterns in the mud that mirrored the shape of broken shields. And the men, weathered with grief, sharpened spears against stone with movements that felt as steady as heartbeat. The river, eternal witness, bore no allegiance. Yet in the minds of the Slavs, it had taken sides. It had swallowed the invader, fed on their cries, and carried fragments of shattered boats downstream into reeds where birds nested undisturbed. The raven, black-winged harbinger, had flown many times across these skies, circling above battlefields like a shadow of prophecy. And so the elders whispered that one day the raven itself would fall, and when it did, the tide of fate would shift for all who lived by ambush and memory. On this morning, the youngest scouts returned with tidings. Across the marsh, Viking war bands stirred once more, their patience thinned by hunger, their pride wounded deeper than any flesh. They were learning, adapting, no longer charging blindly into water's teeth, no longer laughing at the forest as if it were mere kindling to be cut and burned. Instead, they moved with slower steps, shields raised not only against arrows, but against the silence itself. They had begun to speak less, to look more, and that made them dangerous in a new way. Yet the Slavs also learned. The traps grew subtler, the deception layered like reeds woven into wicker. Instead of one path to lure the enemy, there were three, each leading into a labyrinth of snares and false trails. Dummies clothed in scraps of tunic stood in shadow to draw arrow shots. Mud-slicked logs were set across gullies to send heavy-footed pursuers tumbling into pits. The forest itself became a maze of living hostility, an ally carved by patience rather than steel. Among them was a youth named Radovan, whose name meant joy of war, though joy seemed far from his eyes. He had been but a boy when the first ships cut into the riverbanks, when the first cries echoed through the marsh at night. Now his hands carried a spear with steadiness. His shoulders bore the weight of an ashwood shield, and his ears caught every shift in the reeds, as though the land whispered personally to him. Elders trusted his silence, for he listened long before he spoke. And when he did speak, his words bore the clarity of the river's flow. Radovan's gaze followed the raven that morning. Black wings spread wide as it circled above the mist. He thought of the tales, how the raven was the messenger of both gods and doom, how it feasted upon the slain without choosing sides. To him, the bird was not only an omen, but a question. Would they forever live by ambush, feeding the raven with blood? Or would there come a day when the bird itself fell silent, leaving only the whispers of reeds and the slow chant of water? When the Vikings advanced again, the clash was quieter than the first. No great roar, no thunder of axes. They came with care, shields overlapping, steps measured, as though wary of each ripple in the water. Yet still, the traps took them. A man's cry broke when he plunged into hidden stakes, another when a net tightened around his limbs like a serpent. Arrows hissed from reeds, spears whistled from shadows, and the forest itself seemed to close around them. But among the Norse was one who did not falter. A chieftain scarred by earlier defeats, eyes glinting with cold fire, his braids bound in strips of leather darkened by old blood. He strode into the traps and, unlike his fellows, tested each ground before stepping, drove back reeds with his spear butt, and barked orders that steadied his warriors. Slowly, painfully, the Vikings adapted, pulling comrades from nets, burning reeds to expose hidden bowmen, smashing effigies with laughter that sounded more like defiance than triumph. For hours the struggle wove back, and forth like a tide without moon. Bodies sank into mud, arrows stuck in trunks, spears shattered on shields, and the raven wheeled above it all. By dusk, neither side claimed true victory. The Vikings withdrew again, bloodied but not broken, and the Slavs retreated into their hidden hollows, counting losses by firelight, binding wounds with cloth steeped in herbs. That night, Radovan sat by the bank, staring at the water where the moon wavered. The raven landed near, its feathers glossy even in dim light, and cocked its head toward him as though waiting. He whispered words no one else heard, of weariness, of longing for peace, of the weight that even victory could not lift. And when the raven launched into the night sky once more, Radovan felt that it carried his words away, perhaps to gods who did not answer, perhaps only into the endless dark. The elders spoke softly then, gathered around embers. They said each battle was not merely for land, not merely for pride, but for memory. The memory of a people who would not be erased, whose children would one day stand without fear beside the river. Yet memory was also a burden, heavy as the stones they stacked into cairns for the fallen. And so, the question lingered, when the raven makes its last flight, will silence bring peace, or merely another shadow? Thus the story flowed into another night, the river whispering its endless hymn, and the tribes holding fast to the fragile thread of defiance woven through the mist. Greetings, my wandering listeners, who drift now between shadow and memory. Tonight we step once more into the mists, where oaths are tested, where blood and breath mingle with fog, and where warriors of both North and Highland meet their last measure. The wind curls low across the glens, carrying voices that are neither fully alive nor fully gone, but clinging to the stones that bore witness. Let us go quietly into that haunted place and see how the tale bends toward its reckoning. The year was still young when the final march began. Winter had eased its grip upon the highlands, though patches of snow still clung to the peaks, and the rivers ran swollen with meltwater. The Vikings, bloodied yet unbroken, had not given up their hunger for land, for plunder, for mastery. But their leader, Sigurd the Grey-Eyed, had learned more of caution since first tasting the spears of the Picts. His beard, streaked with frost and ash, fell over the rings of mail that no longer gleamed with pride, but dulled beneath salt and blood. Each man who still followed him bore scars, some hidden, some cruelly etched upon face and limb. Yet still they followed, for to turn back was to face shame, and shame was heavier than iron. Across the moors, the Picts gathered also, more numerous than before, drawn from hill and forest, marsh and stone. Their chieftains had whispered through the long winter nights, binding clans that once feuded to face the greater tide. Oaths were cut into flesh, spirals and beasts inked deeper with ash and fire, so that skin itself carried covenant. At the head stood Brood, son of Cale, a man no longer young, yet his shoulders carried memory of too many dead, too many villages burned. His eyes burned with that quiet fury that is born not from rage alone, but from sorrow, layered too thick to bury. The glen chosen for battle was narrow, hemmed by ridges that rose like broken teeth. A river wound through its heart, swollen and fast, splitting the ground into patches of sodden earth and treacherous stone. Here the Picts laid their lines, spears fixed, shields marked with paint that gleamed like wet bark in the dawn. Archers found perches high among the crags, where shadows stretched long and waiting. Drums were silent. There would be no call to announce them. Only the mist itself, thick as wool, was their herald. The Vikings came in mourning, axes slung, boots breaking the crust of thawing frost. Their ships had landed once more upon the firth, black beasts chained to the shore, and now their men pressed inland with the grim determination of those who knew the weight of failure. For 3 days they had marched, harried at night by whispers in the dark, stones hurled from unseen hands, arrows that vanished into the fog before striking. Each man felt the unseen eyes of the highlands upon him, and none slept sound. As they entered the glen, silence deepened. Even the gulls that followed inland were gone. Sigurd raised his axe, rune-carved and pitted from years of blood, and spoke not to rally, but simply to be heard. We take this place, or we are taken by it. Stand firm, and no ghost will have you. But the ghosts were already there. From the ridges, arrows hissed, falling in long arcs that vanished into bodies below. From the mist, spears thrust, wielded by men painted in woad who seemed to rise out of stone itself. The Vikings roared, shields lifted, axes swung wide to cut through haze and flesh alike. The clash was sudden, brutal, without warning. Iron struck bone, wood shattered, the river churned red where men stumbled and fell. Yet this was not the wild skirmish of earlier raids. The Picts fought with patience, their lines bending but not breaking, their movements guided by signals unseen. Where the Vikings pressed, the mist thickened, and where they faltered, cries echoed from hills that disoriented, turning brothers against shadow. Sigurd found himself locked against Brood, their eyes catching through swirl of fog. Neither spoke. It was not words that bound them, but the inevitability of this meeting, written long before either drew breath. The Viking swung, strength like a falling oak, but Brood turned the blow aside with shield rim iron bound. His own spear darted forward, grazing Sigurd's mail, drawing first blood. The gray-eyed bared his teeth and pressed harder, each strike heavier than the last. Around them, men fell. Some drowned in the river's surge, dragged down by mail too heavy. Some vanished into mist, never to be seen, their cries muffled as though the glen itself swallowed them. Arrows continued their reign, patient as time. And through it all, the Pictish drums remained silent, as though even rhythm might betray the stillness of death that held the field. Hours passed in that suspended storm, until sun began to pierce the fog, weak beams cutting through. Bodies lay thick upon sodden ground, and neither side could claim clear victory. Sigurd himself, blood seeping from a wound along his side, still stood, though swaying. Brood's shield was split, his spear shaft cracked, yet his breath came steady, his eyes unbroken. Then, as if by some unspoken covenant, both leaders stepped back. Not surrender, not truce, but recognition. The glen would claim no more. To press further would be to feed the earth with more lives, and neither was willing to give the land that much power. The Vikings withdrew, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead among stones and river. The Picts held their ground, silent as carved idols, watching until the last shadow of the Northmen vanished into distance. And so the reckoning came, not with the shattering of one side, but with the endurance of both. The highlands would not yield, and neither would the sea. In the quiet aftermath, mist settled once more, shrouding corpses until even they became part of the land. Ravens descended, their cries echoing across the glen, carrying away the last voices of those who had fallen. That night, Brood stood upon the ridge, gazing toward the distant firth, where dragon-prowed ships still lingered, dark against horizon. He knew they would return. Whether in months or years, hunger does not sleep. Yet he also knew the highlands would endure, as it always had, through storm and shadow. And in his heart, he carried not triumph, but a quieter vow, that the memory of those who had bled upon these stones would never be lost, that each spiral inked upon flesh was not mere paint, but history itself, written in lines of survival. For memory, too, is a kind of victory. And so, dear listener, the fog closes around us once more. The clash has ebbed, but echoes remain, whispered through stone and stream, through raven's cry and silent drum. The reckoning of the Highlands is not a single battle, but the unending endurance of a people who refuse to vanish. Hushed one, still with me across the long trail of words and hours, let us draw close for the final fold of this tale. The night outside has shifted many times since the first whisper of Pict and Viking, and now we find ourselves at the last veil, where endings bend into beginnings, where the mist itself seems to sigh with weariness, as though even the land is ready to sleep. The Highland winds softened in those years after the battles, not because peace truly reigned. It never does for long in a land divided by rivers, heather, and stone, but because memory itself acted like a leash on ambition. The Vikings still came, their sails ragged with salt, but less often did they press so far inland. The names of the valleys where men had vanished, Misty Pass, Broken Glen, Spearwood, grew heavy with warnings, whispered by mothers to children, by old warriors to the young. Among the Picts, songs lengthened. Stories of the night when entire columns of iron-clad strangers walked into the fog and did not return grew sharper with every retelling. Standing stones were carved with deeper spirals, darker dyes pressed into the skin of stone to hold the memory. The people knew their true weapon had not been axe or bow, but patience. The mist itself was their ally, and silence their oldest friend. Yet even patience must learn to breathe. After many winters, some Picts laid down their painted shields and turned to farming deeper valleys. Children who had never seen a Viking raid came of age, hearing only the fading tremor of stories. The spiral tattoos of the old clans looked strange upon younger skin, less a vow of defiance and more a relic. With time, many no longer carved themselves so fiercely, though the stones still stood. Still, there were keepers, quiet watchers who would not let the memory fade. They carried embers of story the way one carries a coal in winter, hidden in wool, glowing just enough to light a fire when needed. In their dreams, they still walked the old ambush paths. They still felt the cold kiss of fog on their cheeks. These keepers were the reason the Highlands remained untamed, even as generations softened. And the Vikings? Their sagas, too, carried the weight of the mists. Skalds sang of vanished warbands swallowed by ghosts. Some clans, fierce as wolves, kept testing fate, but the wiser ones steered south and west, toward easier plunder. The Highlands earned a reputation, land of shadow, land of loss. And in this way, absence itself became defense. But the sagas did more than frighten. They also remembered. In smoky halls, beneath whalebone rafters, old raiders told the young, there is a place where the land itself fights you, where every stone is an eye, where every tree whispers your death. Respect it or vanish. Thus did even enemies become guardians of the tale, warning their own against arrogance. Centuries later, long after the last woad had faded from human skin, long after both Pict and Viking had been swallowed into larger names, Scot, Norse, Gael, the stones still stood. Heather grew thick around them. Sheep grazed where warriors once crouched. Children ran circles about the spirals carved in rock, laughing, unaware that their play traced old scars. Yet on certain mornings, when the mist thickened and the dew clung heavy, even those children slowed. The land itself whispered again, in that way mist does, like voices caught just beyond hearing. And the shepherds, older and quieter, would not walk certain paths until the fog lifted. Memory lives in land longer than in blood. So it was that the tale of the Picts and their ghostly defense became not just history, but atmosphere. It was in the silence of valleys, the stillness of mornings, the shiver that passed through even the bold when they saw stones loom in fog. The Vikings had not been the first to fear such places, nor the last. For in truth, what had been defended was not only soil or hearth, but the sanctity of mystery itself. The Picts, with their painted skin and spiral stones, taught the world something no sword could, that terror and wonder often wear the same face. And when an enemy enters mist, it is not always death he meets. Sometimes it is himself. And so, my listening one, we close the circle. We have walked through ambush and silence, through arrows from unseen ridges, through sagas of those who came and those who vanished. We have stood by stones that outlast empires, and we have felt the weight of memory pressing like fog against the skin. This is the end of the story of the Picts, ghosts of the Highland Mist. Yet endings, like mists, never remain still. They drift, they part, they return. Perhaps one day you will stand in Scotland's Highlands, and the fog will curl about your legs. And for a moment you will wonder, am I alone? Or am I being watched by eyes older than the stones themselves? Let that wonder stay with you. It is the last gift of this tale. Sleep now, traveler. The mist is thick and gentle. Let it close about you as it once closed about armies. In silence, in patience, in breath, find your rest.